The great age-silvered wooden door of the archive, a door as thick as a man's chest and bound with bands of ancient patinated bronze, sighed shut with a sound like the deep exhalation of a sleeping giant. Elias Thorne, the 55-year-old, keeper of this secluded sanctuary of seeds, listened to the familiar resonance of the tumblers engaging within the massive lock, a sound that had punctuated the end of his working day for more than 3 decades. The last sliver of the afternoon sun, which had briefly illuminated the countless meticulously labeled drawers and clay vessels lining the cool stone walls of the repository, was now extinguished, leaving the precious dormant life within too, its silent, patient waiting. Outside, the air in the hidden valley was beginning to cool, carrying the mingled scents of damp earth, rare alpine blossoms that bloomed only in this sheltered microclimate, and the resinous perfume of the ancient, sentinel-like conifers that guarded the valley's perimeter. Elias, a man whose quiet demeanor mirrored the profound stillness of the place he served, felt the familiar shift from the focused diligence of his duties, cataloging, inspecting, ensuring the precise conditions for long-term viability, to the more introspective, gentle unwinding that preceded his own nightly rest. His work was a sacred trust, a covenant with generations past and generations yet to come, attending not just of seeds, but of hope itself, of the earth's enduring promise of renewal. But now, as the twilight draped its soft velvet cloak over the valley, a different kind of tending was required. The tending of his own spirit, the preparation for that equally sacred, equally necessary surrender to sleep. He stood for a moment, just outside the archive door, his hand still resting on the cool, smooth bronze of the ancient handle. The valley, known only to a select few and fiercely protected from the encroachments of the wider, more hurried world, was already sinking into shadow, though the highest snow-capped peaks that ringed it still caught the last fiery kiss of the departed sun, glowing like celestial altars against the deepening indigo sky. The only sounds were the gentle murmur of the glacier-fed stream that meandered through the valley floor, the distant, haunting call of a nightjar, and the almost imperceptible whisper of the evening breeze through the leaves of the ancient, gnarled apple trees that formed an orchard near his small stone cottage. It was a peace so profound, so encompassing, it felt as if one could reach out and touch it. A peace that was both a gift of the place and a reflection of the Maker who had fashioned it. Yet, Elias knew, even in such a sanctuary, the human heart could sometimes find itself a restless pilgrim, its own inner landscape not always mirroring the serenity of its surroundings. Have you ever found it so, dear listener, that even in moments of profound external quiet, the inner chambers of the heart can still echo with the day's concerns, with unspoken questions, with the gentle but persistent hum of a mind not yet ready to release its vigil? It is in these times, isn't it, that we yearn not just for an absence of noise, but for a deeper, more resonant peace, a stillness that touches the very core of our being. Elias's unease tonight, if it could even be called such, was not a sharp, defined anxiety. There had been no particular crisis in the archive, no immediate threat to the precious collection he guarded. The rare lunar moth orchid seeds he had been meticulously cataloging earlier had been safely stored. The delicate temperature and humidity controls within the repository were functioning perfectly. It was something more subtle, a faint, almost melancholic awareness of the immense passage of time that this place represented, of the countless seasons of growth, bloom, decay, and dormancy that lay encapsulated within the fragile husks of the seeds under his care. He thought of the generations of keepers before him, men and women who had dedicated their lives to this same quiet, patient work, their names carved into the stone lintel above the archive door, their spirits, he sometimes felt still lingering in the cool, silent air within. And with that thought came a familiar, gentle ache, a sense of his own brief span within this long, enduring chain, a quiet questioning of his own faithfulness, his own small contribution to this vast, sacred legacy. These were not burdensome thoughts, not anymore. Years of contemplation and a deepening faith had softened their edges, but they were companions, prompts to a deeper reliance, a more conscious leaning into the eternal. Lord of all seasons, you who hold all time in your hand, Elias whispered, his voice barely disturbing the profound stillness, the words less a formal prayer and more a continuation of an ongoing internal conversation. He often spoke to God in this way, directly, simply, as one might speak to a deeply trusted, infinitely wise elder. His faith was not rooted in complex theological arguments, but in the tangible daily wonders of the created world that surrounded him, in the miraculous, tenacious life force he witnessed in every seed, every sprouting seedling, every ancient tree. He saw God's hand not just in the grand sweep of the mountains, but in the microscopic perfection of a pollen grain, in the intricate divine blueprint coiled within the smallest, most unassuming seed. He remembered the parables of Jesus, the mustard seed growing into a great tree, the sower scattering seed on different kinds of ground. These were not just agricultural allegories to Elias. They were profound spiritual truths, speaking of hidden potential, of the power of seemingly insignificant beginnings, of the vital importance of a receptive heart, a fertile soil for the divine word to take root and flourish. He began his slow walk towards his cottage, a small, sturdy structure of local stone and weathered timber nestled beside the ancient orchard. The path was carpeted with soft moss and fallen pine needles, muffling his footsteps. The air grew cooler, carrying the clean, sharp scent of approaching night in the high valley. He consciously began to release the day, not by forcibly shutting down his thoughts, but by gently acknowledging them and then offering them up, one by one, like precious but weighty seeds he was placing into the vast, benevolent palm of God. The slight concern he'd felt about a predicted shift in the long-term climate patterns and its potential impact on some of the more fragile alpine species in their care, he visualized that worry, acknowledged its legitimacy, and then entrusted it to the Creator who had set the stars in their courses and the seasons in their cycle. The quiet sense of responsibility for the young apprentice, Lyra, who was due to arrive in a few weeks for her summer tutelage, her eagerness mingled with a palpable nervousness he discerned in her letters. He offered that concern for her well-being, for his own ability to guide her wisely, to the great teacher, the source of all true wisdom. With each act of mental surrender, he felt a corresponding lightness in his own spirit, a subtle unwinding of inner tension, as if a tightly bound scroll were being gently unfurled. He thought of the profound dormancy that characterized the seeds in the archive. For years, decades, even centuries, some of them lay in their cool, dark stillness, appearing lifeless, inert. Yet within each one, an incredible, potent life force slumbered, awaiting the precise conditions, the perfect moment, to awaken, to unfurl, to reach for the light. Sleep, Elias often mused, was a human equivalent of that sacred dormancy. It was a time when the outward activities of life ceased, when the conscious mind grew still, allowing for a deeper, hidden work of restoration, of renewal, of gathering strength for a future awakening. It was not an empty void, but a fertile darkness, a period of profound, unseen alchemy where weariness was transformed into vitality, where stress was dissolved, and where the spirit, perhaps, could commune more directly with its source, unhindered by the clamor of waking thought. "He gives his beloved sleep," the psalmist had written. Elias understood this not just as a cessation of consciousness, but as a profound gift, an act of divine grace, a sacred space for recreation. His cottage was welcoming, a single oil lamp already burning on the simple wooden table, left lit by him earlier, its flame a small, steady beacon in the gathering gloom. The interior was simple, almost monastic, yet filled with a sense of warmth and peace. Books lined rough-hewn shelves, Not just botanical texts and records of the archive, but volumes of poetry, philosophy, and, most prominently, a large, heavily bound Bible, its pages thin and soft from generations of use, passed down from the first keeper of this valley. A small hearth, swept clean, awaited the evening fire. Elias moved with a quiet sense of order, performing the small tasks that transitioned him from his public role as keeper to his private existence as a solitary man of God. He washed his hands and face in a basin of cool spring water, the sensation, refreshing, cleansing away the dust of the day, both literal and metaphorical. He changed from his sturdy work clothes into softer, more comfortable garments. Each action was performed with a mindful presence, a gentle preparation for the deeper stillness to come. He remembered the story of Adam in the Garden of Eden, before the fall. Scripture said that God would walk in the garden in the cool of the day. Elias often felt that same divine companionship in his own valley, especially in these quiet twilight hours, and as he prepared for the cool of the day within his own soul that was sleep. He imagined God not as a distant judgmental deity, but as a gentle gardener, walking through the hidden pathways of his heart, tending to the small, fragile hopes, pruning away the anxieties, watering the seeds of faith that sometimes struggled in the drier soils of human doubt. This image brought him immense comfort, a sense of being known, of being cared for, with an intimacy that transcended words. And if the divine gardener was tending his inner landscape, then he could surely release his own anxious efforts to control and manage and simply allow that loving, skillful hand to do its perfect work. He prepared a simple meal, a bowl of vegetable soup made with produce from his own small garden patch, a thick slice of the dense, dark bread he baked himself once a week. He ate slowly, seated at his table, the only sounds the gentle crackling of the newly kindled fire in the hearth and the distant, constant murmur of the stream. He savored each spoonful, not just the taste of the food, but the knowledge of its origins, the carrots and potatoes he had pulled from the earth with his own hands, the herbs he had gathered from the hillside. There was a profound connection, in this simple act, a participation in the cycles of growth and sustenance that bound him to this valley, to the earth, to the God who provided all things. And as he ate, he felt the last vestiges of the day's subtle disquiet melting away, replaced by a deep, pervasive sense of contentment, of peace, of gratitude. The table, he felt, was often a place of communion, not just with physical food, but with the giver of all good gifts. He thought of the manna provided for the Israelites in the wilderness, a daily provision, just enough for their needs, a constant reminder of their dependence on God's grace. Elias felt that peace, true soul peace, was a similar kind of manna. It wasn't something he could stockpile from a particularly good day or a powerful spiritual experience. Each evening, as he prepared for sleep, he needed to come afresh to the source, to consciously release the day's specific burdens, the day's unique anxieties, and to receive a fresh impartation of that divine tranquility, that spiritual nourishment, that would sustain him through the hidden hours of the night and prepare him for the dawn of a new day. Sleep, in this context, was the ultimate act of receiving that manna, a profound expression of trust in the ongoing daily provision of God's sustaining grace. The fire in the hearth now burned brightly, casting a warm, dancing light around the small room. The ancient apple tree outside his window, its branches gnarled and dark against the star-dusted sky, seemed to lean in, a silent, benevolent guardian. Elias felt a profound sense of being sheltered, of being safe, not just within the stone walls of his cottage, but within the much larger, much stronger embrace of God's love. The vastness of the universe outside, with its silent, wheeling galaxies, no longer felt overwhelming or intimidating, but rather a magnificent testament to the power and the artistry of the Creator, who also cared intimately and tenderly for the smallest seed, for the quietest human heart. His eyelids were growing heavy, a welcome signal. The invitation to rest, to enter that sacred dormancy, was strong and clear. The keeper of the seeds, weary from his labors of watchfulness and care, was now ready to be kept, to be watched over, to be restored by the great keeper of all life. Settle in now, dear listener, as Elias prepares to answer that gentle, divine summons to rest. What seeds of worry or concern are you still holding from the day that is past? Can you, like Elias, visualize yourself placing them, one by one, into the gentle, capable hands of the master gardener, trusting that he knows best how to tend them, how to bring forth good even from what seems barren or anxious? Allow the profound peace of this hidden valley, the quiet faith of this solitary seed keeper, the timeless murmur of the stream, to draw you into a state of deeper calm, of serene receptivity. Let go of the day's striving, release its subtle tensions, and prepare your own heart soil to receive the life-giving dew of God's restorative peace. The journey into his quiet, fertile darkness is beginning. Elias rose from his simple table, the lingering warmth of the soup and the flickering light of the hearth, creating a cocoon of comfort in his small stone cottage. The deep silence of the valley, broken only by the stream's eternal murmur and the occasional soft whisper of the night wind around the eaves, enveloped him like a familiar, cherished cloak. He moved with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man whose life was attuned to the slow, ancient rhythms of nature, rather than the frenetic, artificial tempos of the world beyond this secluded sanctuary. His preparations for sleep were themselves a form of quiet ritual, a gentle unwinding that mirrored the way a tightly coiled fern frond unfurls in the warmth of spring. Each movement a conscious step towards the complete surrender that true rest required. The peace that had begun to settle deeply within him during his evening meal was now a palpable presence, as tangible as the age-smoothed wood of the chair he had just vacated. A peace that was both a gift received and a state cultivated through years of quiet faith and solitary contemplation. He banked the fire in the hearth carefully, ensuring the embers would smolder safely through the night, ready to be coaxed back to life in the chill of the early morning. This small act of foresight, of providing for future warmth, felt like an echo of his day's work in the seed archive, a preserving of potential, a trust in the continuity of life. He then went to the sturdy wooden shelf where his large, ancestral Bible lay. He didn't light another candle to read by. His eyes were already heavy, and the desire for sleep was a gentle but persuasive call. Instead, he simply ran his hand over the worn leather cover, its surface supple and familiar. Beneath his touch, a connection to the generations of keepers who had turned its pages, who had found solace and wisdom within its ancient words. In that tactile connection, there was a profound sense of lineage, of being part of an unbroken chain of faith, a stream of quiet devotion that had flowed through this valley for as long as the archive had stood. It was a comforting thought, a reminder that he was not alone in his vigil, that his own small efforts were part of a much larger, more enduring story. His gaze drifted to the small, deeply recessed window, through which a few brilliant stars could be seen, hard and clear, in the crystalline mountain air. He thought of Abraham, called by God to look at the stars, to number them if he could, a promise of descendants as countless as the heavenly host. Abraham, a man who had journeyed in faith, often not knowing his destination, sustained by a divine promise. Elias felt a kinship with that ancient patriarch. His own journey was quieter, more circumscribed, largely confined to this hidden valley. Yet it too was a journey of faith, a daily reliance on God's provision, a trust in promises often unseen, like the promise of life held dormant within each tiny seed. And just as Abraham had found reassurance in the vastness of the night sky, Elias found in it a sense of perspective, a reminder of the immensity of God's creation and the smallness, yet preciousness, of his own individual life within that grand design. This perspective helped to loosen the grip of any lingering personal anxieties, placing them against a backdrop of eternal, unwavering faithfulness. He remembered the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel after his dramatic confrontation with the prophets of Baal. Exhausted by the spiritual battle and the subsequent slaughter, Elijah had sent his servant to look for rain, a sign of God's blessing after a long drought. 7 times the servant went, and 7 times he returned seeing nothing, until finally a cloud the size of a man's hand appeared, a small portent of the abundant rain that would soon refresh the parched land. Elias often thought that the peace he sought, especially on nights when weariness or subtle disquiet troubled him, was like that small cloud. Sometimes it seemed elusive, almost non-existent. But if he persisted in his quiet waiting, in his gentle turning towards God, eventually that small cloud of peace would appear on the horizon of his inner sky, gradually expanding, bringing with it a refreshing, soul-quenching rain of serenity. Sleep itself felt like that promised rain, a divine gift that washed away the dust and heat of the day, restoring the parched ground of his spirit. His small sleeping alcove was at the rear of the cottage, its window facing east, towards the mountainside where the sun would first touch the valley in the morning. It was a simple, almost austere space, a low wooden bed frame, a thick mattress stuffed with fragrant dried meadow grasses and lavender, and heavy woolen blankets woven by the women of a distant village generations ago. As he sat on the edge of the bed, the coolness of the stone floor a brief sensation against his bare feet, he felt the day's remaining energies gently ebbing away, replaced by a profound sense of readiness for rest. There was no resistance, no mental bargaining for a few more minutes of wakefulness. His body knew its need. His spirit welcomed the release. He recalled Jesus' words to his disciples on the stormy Sea of Galilee just before he calmed the wind and the waves. "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" Elias knew that fear and lack of faith were often the greatest barriers to peace, to rest. Fear of the unknown future, fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of one's own inadequacy. These were the inner tempests that could keep the soul churned and agitated, preventing it from finding that quiet harbor of trust. And faith, he understood, was not a blind dismissal of reality, but a conscious choice to focus on a greater reality, the reality of God's sovereign love, His unwavering power, His perfect wisdom. Tonight, his own small boat of faith felt securely anchored, not because there were no potential storms on the horizon of life, but because he had chosen to entrust his vessel and its voyage to the Master of the Seas. This quiet, settled faith was the key that unlocked the door to profound, untroubled repose. He lay down beneath the heavy blankets, their familiar weight a comforting pressure. The scent of the dried grasses and lavender in his mattress was a subtle, soothing aromatherapy, a fragrance deeply associated with rest and peace in this valley. He closed his eyes, and the sounds of the night became more intimate, more present. The gentle crackle of the dying embers in the hearth, a sound like distant, friendly conversation. The soft sigh of the wind as it found its way around the sturdy corners of his stone cottage, a sound like the valley itself breathing, and the eternal, constant murmur of the stream, a timeless lullaby that had sung generations of keepers to sleep. These were the sounds of his solitude, but it was a solitude filled with presence, the presence of creation, the presence of God, a profound sense of being enfolded, of being held in a vast, benevolent embrace, settled over him. It was a feeling he often experienced in these final moments before sleep claimed him, a sense of all his carefully maintained defenses, his necessary daytime vigilance, dissolving, allowing him to become simply a trusting child in the arms of a loving father. There was no need for pretense here, no need for striving. He was known fully and completely in all his strengths and all his weaknesses, and he was loved unconditionally and eternally. This assurance was the softest bed, the most secure shelter, the most potent medicine for any residual weariness of soul. His thoughts, now barely coherent, began to fragment, to dissolve like mist in the gentle warmth of oncoming sleep. Images might flicker for a moment. A perfectly formed seed held in the palm of his hand, a field of impossibly vibrant wildflowers under a summer sky, the ancient, wise face of the mountains that ringed his valley. But they were like soft, disconnected brushstrokes on a canvas of deep, encroaching peace. He was no longer actively reflecting or remembering. He was simply yielding, surrendering to the natural God-given rhythm of rest and renewal. The keeper of countless sleeping seeds was now himself entering that same sacred, fertile darkness, trusting in the same promise of life, the same hope of awakening, that was held within each tiny, precious charge in his archive. The valley of seeds was becoming a valley of profound, restorative sleep for its faithful guardian. The gentle tide of slumber, having drawn Elias away from the familiar shores of conscious thought, now carried him into the deeper, more mysterious waters of profound sleep. The last echoes of the valley's night sounds, the stream's soft murmur, the wind's quiet sigh, faded into an all-encompassing silence, a silence not of emptiness, but of profound restorative peace. His breathing, now as slow and even as the barely perceptible rise and fall of the valley floor itself with the changing seasons, was the only outward sign of the life force that animated his resting form. In this sacred, hidden realm, the conscious keeper of the seeds became himself a seed, planted in the fertile darkness of God's grace, awaiting the quiet miracle of unseen growth and renewal. The flickering light of the hearth had long since surrendered to embers, and the stars outside his small window kept their remote, silent vigil, their ancient light a testament to a cosmic order and a divine faithfulness that far transcended the understanding of his sleeping mind, yet in which his spirit was deeply, securely, and peacefully anchored. In this state of profound unconsciousness, where the ego's ceaseless chatter is stilled and the soul's deepest defenses are lowered, a unique form of spiritual receptivity often unfolds. For Elias, these hours were not a mere blankness, a cessation of being, but rather a period of profound, albeit passive, communion. It was as if his spirit, freed from the limitations of the physical senses and the discursive mind, could absorb the divine presence more directly, more fully, like a parched sponge soaking up life-giving water. The worries and concerns that had been consciously released before sleep were now not just set aside, but were being gently dissolved, their subtle energetic imprints smoothed away by the healing balm of God's unconditional love. This was a deep, cellular cleansing, a spiritual recalibration that occurred beyond the reach of his will or understanding, a pure act of divine grace ministering to his innermost needs. If his mind, in its dormant state, still produced any imagery, it was unlikely to be the narrative dreams of lighter sleep. Instead, it might be impressions of pure, formless light, a sense of being bathed in an effulgent golden radiance that was both intensely powerful and infinitely gentle, a light that seemed to penetrate to the very core of his being, healing, restoring, and illuminating all the hidden places. Or perhaps he experienced a sensation of floating in a boundless ocean of peace, where every current was a current of love, every wave a caress of grace, and the overwhelming feeling was one of perfect safety, perfect belonging, perfect joy. These were not experiences to be analyzed or interpreted, but rather sacred immersions, profound spiritual encounters that were subtly reteaching his soul the language of its true home, the native dialect of divine love. He remembered the biblical account of Jacob's dream at Bethel, a ladder set up on the earth, its top reaching to heaven, with angels of God ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood above it, reaffirming his covenant promises. Jacob, awakening, had exclaimed, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Elias had often felt that his own deep, peaceful sleep, especially in this secluded valley, could be a similar kind of Bethel, a place where the veil between heaven and earth grew thin, where unseen angelic ministrations occurred, where the divine presence was not just a theological concept but a palpable restorative reality. He might not awaken with a dramatic vision or a new name, but he consistently awakened with a renewed anointing of peace, a strengthened faith, a clearer sense of God's nearness, the quiet, unmistakable evidence of having been, in some mysterious way, at the very gate of heaven. The physical temple of his body, now completely at rest, was undergoing its own miraculous, divinely ordained processes of repair and regeneration. Tissues were mended, cellular waste was removed, energy reserves were replenished, all with a quiet efficiency that was unhindered by mental stress or emotional turmoil. The profound peace that saturated his spirit created the optimal internal environment for this physical healing. It was a holistic restoration, acknowledging the deep, intricate connection between mind, body, and spirit, a testament to the Creator's perfect design. Just as the seeds in his archive required precise conditions of stillness and darkness for their long-term viability, so too did his own human frame require these periods of deep, undisturbed rest to maintain its delicate balance and its capacity for life. He recalled the story of Jesus sleeping in the stern of the boat during the storm, his peace so absolute that even the raging elements could not disturb it. While his disciples, seasoned sailors though they were, succumbed to fear, Jesus rested in the perfect assurance of his Father's care. Elias knew his own peace was but a faint echo of that divine serenity, yet it flowed from the same source, a deep, abiding trust in the sovereign love and power of God. And as he slept, buffeted not by literal waves, but by the gentle, rhythmic currents of his own slow breathing, he was, in his own small way, embodying that trust, his entire being, surrendered to the one who commands the winds and the waves, both external and internal. He was safe, not because there were no storms in life, but because his anchor held fast within the veil, secured to the rock of ages. The darkness of his sleeping alcove, a profound, velvety black, now that the last embers in the hearth had faded to a dull glow, was not a frightening or oppressive void. It was a sanctuary, a womb of renewal. It was the darkness of the fertile earth, where a seed must be buried before it can sprout and bring forth new life. It was the darkness of the deep mines, where precious gems are slowly formed under immense pressure and the passage of eons. It was the creative darkness from which God had called forth light at the dawn of creation, and in this personal, sacred darkness, Elias was being unmade and remade, his weariness dissolved, his strength renewed, his spirit gently reshaped by the loving hands of the divine potter. He was yielding to this process with a completeness that was only possible in the utter vulnerability and trust of deep sleep. A profound sense of being cherished, of being infinitely precious in the sight of God, was the unspoken foundation of his rest. It was a knowing that went deeper than words, deeper than emotions, a conviction imprinted on the very fabric of his soul. He was not just a servant, a keeper of seeds. He was a beloved child, resting in the tender, watchful care of his heavenly Father. This assurance was the bedrock of his peace, the unshakable foundation upon which all true rest is built. It banished all fear, all sense of aloneness, allowing him to surrender completely to the healing power of sleep, knowing that he was held in an embrace both infinitely powerful and infinitely gentle. The stars wheeled in their silent, majestic courses across the immense arc of the heavens, their ancient light tracing patterns of divine order. The stream murmured its timeless song through the slumbering valley. The wind whispered secrets through the pine needles. And in his humble stone cottage, Elias Thorne, the keeper of the seeds, slept on, a still, peaceful figure in a world of profound natural tranquility, his spirit communing in ways beyond his waking comprehension with the God of all creation, the God of all peace. He was being refilled at the source, restored at the root, prepared in the silence for the quiet unfolding of another day, another opportunity to witness and participate in the enduring miracle of life, hope, and divine faithfulness. The Valley of Seeds was truly a valley of profound, life-giving slumber for its devoted custodian. The great silent river of deep night flowed on, carrying Elias further into its profound, restorative depths. His individual consciousness, that small, flickering lamp of waking awareness, was entirely subsumed in the vast, luminous ocean of divine peace, a state beyond dreaming, beyond thought, beyond the perception of time itself. The ancient guardian mountains that encircled his hidden valley stood like colossal sleeping sentinels under the diamond-strewn tapestry of the cosmos, and within their protective embrace, the keeper of the seeds rested, his breathing as slow and as even as the geological pulse of the earth itself. The cool, pure air of the high valley, filtering silently into his small stone cottage, was itself an elixir, cleansing and renewing, and his spirit, untethered from the concerns of the flesh, seemed to absorb its essence, along with the even, more subtle, more potent essence of God's all-pervading grace. In this profound state of unconsciousness, the boundary between the created and the Creator felt almost non-existent. It was not that Elias ceased to be, but rather that his being was so perfectly aligned, so utterly surrendered, that he was experiencing a unity with the divine that is rarely accessible to the waking mind, with its constant distractions and its ingrained sense of separateness. This was the peace that passes all understanding, not an intellectual concept, but a lived experiential reality, a complete immersion in the fundamental truth that all things are held, sustained, and lovingly encompassed by the infinite heart of God. It was a peace that did not just soothe the surface, but saturated the very core of his existence, recalibrating his soul to its original intended harmony. If his deeply sleeping mind registered anything, it was not the specific sounds of the valley or the feel of his bed, but perhaps a sense of immense, benevolent light, a light that was also music, a light that was also love, a light that was the very fabric of reality. Or he might feel himself gently cradled, as if by vast, unseen hands, in a place of absolute safety, where no harm could ever penetrate, where all striving had ceased, and where the only impulse was to rest, to receive, to be. These were not fleeting dreams to be recalled upon waking, but profound, formless encounters with the sacred, experiences that were silently reshaping his inner landscape, clearing away the debris of past hurts, strengthening the foundations of his faith, and infusing him with a quiet, unshakable joy. Imagine a master botanist, in the stillness of a specialized laboratory, meticulously examining a precious, dormant seed under a powerful microscope. They see not just the inert outer husk, but the incredible coiled potential within, the intricate blueprint for future life, the promise of flower and fruit. So in the divine laboratory of this deep, sanctified sleep, the great botanist was tending to the seed of Elias's spirit. The husk of his physical weariness, his mental preoccupations, was gently set aside, and the core of his being, that divine spark, was being nourished, revitalized, and imbued with fresh potential. He was being prepared, not just for another day of earthly labor, but for a more abundant spiritual flowering, a richer harvest of the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. This was a sacred horticulture, a divine cultivation occurring in the hidden, fertile darkness. The stone walls of his cottage, quarried from the very mountains that sheltered the valley, were more than just physical protection. They were a symbol of the enduring, rock-solid refuge Elias found in his faith. And within these walls, in the complete vulnerability of his deepest sleep, He was experiencing the fullness of that divine shelter. He was a pilgrim who had reached the innermost sanctum, a traveler who had found the ultimate haven. There was no need for vigilance, no place for fear. He was utterly, completely, and perfectly safe, held in a divine embrace that was both infinitely tender and omnipotently strong. This profound sense of security was the fertile ground in which the seeds of true restoration could germinate and flourish. Consider the scriptural promise. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. For Elias, living a life so attuned to the rhythms of nature, these words held a deep, literal resonance. The sun, the moon, the elements, these were powerful forces he respected, but in his sleep, he was experiencing their spiritual counterpart, a divine keeping that shielded him from the harsh glare of worldly anxieties by day, his waking hours, and the subtle, sometimes chilling, fears that can creep in during the night, both literal and metaphorical darkness. This divine shade was not a place of gloom, but of cool, refreshing respite, a place where his soul could be shielded from the too bright, often overwhelming stimuli of life, and find its true refreshment. The absolute stillness that enveloped him was not the stillness of death, but the vibrant, pregnant stillness of deep winter, when all of nature seems to hold its breath, gathering its strength for the explosive renewal of spring. It was the stillness of a perfectly tuned string, holding within it the potential for beautiful music. It was the stillness of a deep, clear pool, holding within its depths the reflection of the entire cosmos. In this profound quietude, the subtle, often unheard voice of God was not just a whisper, but the very atmosphere, the resonant silence that underlay all of creation, speaking directly to Elias's spirit in a language deeper than words, a language of pure being, of unconditional love. The great, silent congregation of stars outside his window continued their ancient, celestial procession, their light a myriad of tiny, distant beacons in the vast ocean of night. They spoke of faithfulness, of an order that transcended human understanding, of a beauty that was both awe-inspiring and deeply comforting. And Elias, though his eyes were closed to their physical light, seemed to be absorbing their spiritual essence, his own small spirit aligning itself with that grand cosmic harmony. He was a tiny, precious seed of light, resting in the vast, fertile darkness of God's creative love, awaiting the dawn, not with anxiety, but with a deep, peaceful assurance. The keeper of the seeds of Eldoria slept on, his earthly responsibilities laid aside, his spirit free to journey into the profound, restorative realms of divine peace. He was being tended by the great keeper of all life, nourished by the hidden manna of grace, renewed by the living waters of the Spirit. The valley, his sanctuary, was now a sacred crucible, and his sleep, a holy alchemy, transforming weariness into strength, anxiety into peace, and the shadows of doubt into the quiet, steady light of unwavering faith. The night was at its deepest, the rest at its most profound, and in that perfect stillness, all was well, all was held, all was holy. The profound, velvety embrace of the deepest night held Elias in its unwavering stillness, a sacred pause in the rhythm of his existence, where the temporal world receded to an almost infinite distance, and the eternal became blessedly, tangibly near. His body, an instrument laid aside after a day of faithful use, was utterly quiescent. Every nerve, every muscle, every fiber surrendered to the deep, healing currents of restorative sleep. The only perceptible motion was the slow, almost imperceptible, rise and fall of his chest, a breathing so profound and even it seemed to merge with the subtle ancient respiration of the sleeping valley itself. The great silent peaks of Eldoria, their summits perhaps now dusted with the first faint hoar-frost of the high-altitude night, stood as timeless witnesses to this nightly sacrament of renewal, and within their protective circumference, Elias rested, his spirit bathed in a peace that was as boundless and as pure as the starlit cosmos, arching above his humble stone cottage. This was not merely a respite from weariness. It was an immersion in the very wellspring of divine serenity. Imagine a master restorer meticulously working on an ancient, priceless manuscript in the absolute quiet of a climate-controlled vault, far from the damaging influences of light and humidity. With infinite patience and a reverence born of deep understanding, they gently reinforce the fragile parchment, carefully resecure any flaking ink, and ensure that the timeless wisdom held within its pages will be preserved for generations to come. So in the sacred vault of this profound God-given sleep, the divine restorer was tending to the manuscript of Elias's soul. The almost invisible creases of daily stress, the faded passages where enthusiasm might have dimmed, the subtle wear and tear that life inevitably inflicts upon even the most resilient spirit, all were being addressed with a touch of infinite tenderness, infinite skill. This was not a superficial cleaning, but a deep, intrinsic healing, reconnecting him with the original luminous text of his divine anointing, strengthening the binding of his faith, and preparing him to once again share the wisdom and peace he had received. In these profound depths of unconsciousness, where the clamor of the ego is utterly silenced and the soul's carefully constructed defenses are willingly laid down, a remarkable permeability to the divine often occurs. Elias was no longer Elias, the keeper of the seed archive, with his specific set of responsibilities and personal history. He was, in these sacred hours, simply beloved, a unique and precious note in the grand symphony of God's creation, resonating in perfect harmony with the eternal keynote. This was not a terrifying dissolution of self, but a joyful, liberating expansion, a merging with the boundless ocean of divine love, where all illusions of separateness vanish, and only the overwhelming, irrefutable reality of intimate, unconditional belonging remains. In this hallowed state, fear was an alien concept, doubt an impossible intrusion. There was only the profound, all-encompassing certainty of being fully known, fully accepted, and perfectly, eternally loved. Consider the scriptural metaphor of God as a gentle rain falling upon parched land, bringing forth life, refreshment, and abundance where before there was only barrenness and dust. Elias's spirit, in this deep, nocturnal sanctuary, was like that receptive, thirsty earth. Though his conscious mind was at rest, his soul was ardently, albeit passively, absorbing the gentle rain of divine grace, peace, and spiritual nourishment. The hidden springs of his inner life were being replenished. The sometimes compacted soil of his heart was being softened and made fertile, and the dormant seeds of new virtues, new insights, new capacities for love and service were being silently, miraculously quickened. This was the quiet, irresistible power of divine irrigation, ensuring that his inner landscape would remain verdant, fruitful, and capable of sustaining him, and through him, others. The physical vessel of his body, that intricate and wonderfully fashioned temple of the Holy Spirit, continued its deep, divinely orchestrated program of repair and rejuvenation. In the profound peace that saturated his entire being, stress hormones were absent, allowing the body's natural healing systems to operate with unimpeded efficiency. Cellular regeneration occurred at an optimal rate. The immune system was fortified, and the subtle vital energies that animate all life were recharged from their inexhaustible divine source. The profound spiritual rest he was experiencing was inextricably linked to this physical renewal. They were two facets of a single, holistic process of God-given restoration, a testament to the Creator's wisdom in designing humanity for such integrated, life-affirming cycles of activity and profound, peaceful rest. The solitude of his hidden valley, a solitude that might have seemed daunting or isolating to others, was for Elias a profound catalyst for this depth of communion. Far from the incessant demands, the artificial urgencies, and the spiritual static of a more densely populated world, his spirit had learned to attune itself to the quieter, more subtle, yet infinitely more powerful frequencies of the divine. And in the absolute stillness of deepest sleep, this attunement became perfect, his soul like a flawless diamond reflecting the pure, unadulterated light of God's presence. The everyday concerns, the mental chatter, the ego's insistent voice, all were hushed, allowing for an unobstructed, direct infusion of grace, peace, and ineffable love. Think of the biblical concept of being hidden with Christ in God. This was not just a theological doctrine for Elias. It was an experiential reality in these sacred hours of sleep. He was indeed hidden, concealed from the awareness of the world, protected from its potential harms, enfolded in a sanctuary not made with hands, but woven from the very substance of divine love and faithfulness. In this secret place of the Most High, under the shadow of the Almighty, a shadow not of darkness, but of intimate, sheltering presence, he found a security so profound, a peace so complete, that it transcended all earthly understanding. This was the ultimate refuge, the true home of his soul. The great, silent, celestial bodies moved in their majestic, predetermined paths across the velvet expanse of the night sky, their distant ancient light a constant reminder of an order, a wisdom, a power far beyond human ken. Yet the same God who had set these galaxies in motion, who knew each star by name, was also the God who was, at this very moment, bending low over a humble stone cottage in a hidden mountain valley, watching over the sleep of one solitary, beloved man. This breathtaking paradox, the infinite majesty and the intimate tenderness of God, was the unwavering anchor of Elias's faith, the inexhaustible wellspring of his peace. He was a tiny, cherished seed in the vast fertile garden of creation, and the master gardener himself was ensuring his perfect rest, his complete renewal. The keeper of the seeds, himself now a seed of light resting in the fertile darkness of God's care, slept on, undisturbed, untroubled, utterly at peace. The valley of Eldoria, a sanctuary of natural beauty and profound stillness, was the perfect crucible for this nightly alchemy, where weariness was transformed into vibrant strength, where anxiety was dissolved into unshakable serenity, and where the shadows of human doubt were banished by the quiet, steady radiance of divine love. The night was a holy chalice, filled to the brim with grace, and Elias was drinking deeply, his spirit being prepared, in ways beyond his conscious knowing, for the fresh blessings, the new challenges, and the continued opportunities for faithful service that the dawning of another day would inevitably bring. The heart of the night, in its deepest, most silent reign over the secluded valley of Eldoria, continued to cradle Elias in an embrace of profound, almost preternatural peace. Time, as measured by the frantic ticking of worldly clocks, had ceased to exist for him. He was immersed in the eternal now, a timeless present where the only reality was the all-sufficient, all-encompassing presence of God. The ancient Stoic mountains that formed the valley's protective rim stood like colossal, praying monks, their peaks perhaps now dusted with the first faint, crystalline shimmer of starlight on frost. And within this natural cathedral, the keeper of the seeds rested, his soul as still and as clear as a flawless, uncut diamond, reflecting the pure, unadulterated light of divine love. The very air in his humble stone cottage, cool and imbued with the subtle incense of pine and damp earth, seemed to be charged with a sacred energy, a palpable holiness that permeated every fiber of his sleeping form, facilitating a restoration that was not just physical, but profoundly spiritual. Imagine a master artisan, a luthier of unparalleled skill, working in the hushed sanctity of their ancient workshop, restoring a priceless viol, an instrument that has sung 1,000 prayers and wept 1,000 sorrows. With infinite reverence and a touch born of generations of wisdom, they are not merely repairing its physical form, but reawakening its very soul, gently coaxing back the resonance of its aged wood, ensuring that its strings, when next they are touched, will speak with a clarity, a depth, and a sweetness that transcends mere craftsmanship, becoming a conduit for melodies both human and divine. So in the sacred workshop of Elias's deep, sanctified sleep, the divine luthier was tending to the instrument of his spirit. The almost imperceptible dissonances caused by the day's subtle frictions, the areas where the wood of his resolve might have grown a little weary, the strings of his emotions that might have become slightly untuned by small anxieties, all were being addressed with a touch of infinite precision, infinite love. This was not a mere mechanical adjustment, but a holistic retuning, restoring his entire being to its perfect, God-given pitch, preparing him to resonate anew with the harmonies of grace, the melodies of peace. In this state of profound unconsciousness, the insistent voice of the ego, with its endless narratives of self-importance, its fears of inadequacy, its attachments to worldly outcomes, was utterly silenced. Elias was not Elias the esteemed keeper, guardian of a sacred trust, nor Elias the solitary man, with his private hopes and hidden griefs. He was, in these hallowed hours, simply spirit, resting in effortless, joyful union with the Oversoul of God, like a single pure note merging seamlessly into a vast, celestial chord. This was not a negation of his unique identity, but its ultimate fulfillment, a return to the source from which all true identity flows, where the illusion of being separate from love, from God, dissolves, leaving only the blissful, irrefutable reality of an all-embracing, unbreakable communion. It was a peace that was not contingent on external validation or internal striving, but was the natural, inherent state of a soul safely reconnected to its divine origin. Consider the biblical image of the refiner's gold, emerging from the crucible, not diminished but purified, its inherent value and brilliance enhanced by the fiery process that has consumed all dross. For Elias, this deep, tranquil sleep was a different, gentler kind of crucible, a refining fire not of judgment, but of unconditional love, the dross of his human imperfections, the lingering traces of impatience, the subtle films of fear, the almost invisible specks of self-doubt, were being lovingly, almost imperceptibly, consumed by the pervasive, gentle warmth of divine grace. What was emerging, or rather, what was being revealed in its unstained purity, was the true gold of his spirit, fashioned in the image of God, now ready to reflect more brightly, more authentically, the light and character of its compassionate refiner. This was a hallowing occurring in the deepest, most hidden chambers of his being, a quiet, ongoing sanctification that prepared him for a more Christ-like engagement with the world upon his awakening. The physical temple of his body, that intricate and awe-inspiring creation, continued its silent, divinely guided program of profound restoration and renewal. In the complete absence of mental or emotional stress, the body's innate wisdom, its God-given capacity for self-healing, could operate with optimal, unimpeded efficiency. Hormonal balances were being perfected, neurological pathways were being cleared and strengthened, and the very cells of his being were being bathed in a life-giving elixir of peace. The profound spiritual tranquility that enveloped his soul was not a separate phenomenon from this physical rejuvenation. They were, inextricably intertwined, two expressions of the same holistic, divine healing. The body was the fertile ground in which the spirit rested, and the peaceful spirit created the ideal conditions for the body's complete and utter renewal, a testament to the Creator's design for integrated well-being. Elias often thought of the prophet Elijah's experience at Horeb, after the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, where God was found not in the cataclysmic displays of power, but in a still, small voice, or as some translations elegantly render it, a sound of sheer silence. His own deep sleep often felt like an immersion in that sheer silence. It was a silence that was not empty or void, but pregnant with meaning, with presence, with the unspoken, yet overwhelmingly powerful communication of divine love. In this sacred hush, far removed from the cacophony of the world and the chatter of his own mind, his soul could hear, or rather feel, the deepest truths, the most profound reassurances, the gentlest corrections, the most loving affirmations. This was where his truest learning, his deepest spiritual formation often occurred, not through intellectual effort, but through passive, receptive being in the presence of the divine. The vast, silent amphitheater of the Eldoria Valley, its mountain walls reaching towards a sky teeming with the distant silent fire of countless stars, was the perfect setting for this profound nocturnal sacrament. It was a place where the veil between heaven and earth felt exquisitely thin, where the boundary between time and eternity seemed almost to disappear, and Elias, a solitary, slumbering figure in this immense, natural sanctuary, was at the very heart of this mystical convergence. He was not merely an inhabitant of this valley. He was a part of its sacred essence, his own quiet spirit resonating in perfect, harmonious accord with the ancient, silent worship of the mountains, the stars, the stream, the whispering wind, all joining in a ceaseless, unspoken adoration of their Creator. The keeper of the seeds, who by day so meticulously guarded the dormant life entrusted to his care, was now himself a seed of precious potential, resting in the fertile, loving darkness of God's own hand. He was being sheltered from the harsh elements of a fallen world, nourished by the hidden springs of grace, strengthened by the unwavering light of divine faithfulness. The night was not a period of absence or loss, but a time of profound gain, of deep spiritual accretion, of being filled to overflowing from the inexhaustible treasury of God's goodness. He was being prepared, in ways far beyond his waking comprehension, not only to face another day of earthly stewardship, but to grow more fully into the beloved child of God he was always meant to be. His life a quiet testament to the transformative power of divine rest. The valley slept, the stars watched, and the heart of the keeper was held fast, secure and serene, in the everlasting arms. As the deepest, most fathomless part of the night in the hidden valley of Eldoria began its slow, almost imperceptible pivot towards the still distant promise of dawn, the quality of Elias's profound sleep underwent a subtle, gentle modulation. It was not a diminishing of its restorative depth, nor any intrusion upon the encompassing peace that had become his very element, but rather a graceful transition within that serenity, like a great, celestial tide at its slack point, holding all in perfect equilibrium before the almost invisible stirrings of its eventual turn. The absolute oblivion of the midnight hours, where his individual consciousness had seemed to merge completely with the boundless ocean of divine presence, started to subtly give way to a state still profoundly restful, yet perhaps allowing for the faintest, most delicate re-emergence of his own unique spiritual signature within that vast, loving communion. The ancient, silent sentinels of the mountains, their highest peaks perhaps now catching the first, almost spectral foreglow of a moon preparing to set, continued their timeless vigil, and Elias, enfolded in their majestic, protective embrace, was being tenderly, almost imperceptibly, prepared for the gradual journey back towards the world of sensory awareness, his entire being so thoroughly saturated with peace that it felt like an intrinsic, unshakable component of his very essence. Imagine a master artisan, a renowned maker of exquisite stained glass windows, having completed the most intricate and vital work of assembling countless pieces of colored glass into a magnificent, luminous narrative in the deep, focused stillness of their workshop during the night. As the first, palest pre-dawn light begins to filter through the high studio windows, the artisan might gently trace the lead lines with a soft cloth, not to change the design, but to ensure every piece is secure, every joint perfect, allowing the inherent beauty of the assembled whole, to be revealed in its full glory when the true dawn arrives. So it felt as if the divine artisan, having tended to the deepest layers of restoration within Elias's soul, was now gently ensuring the harmonious integration of that healing work, preparing his spirit to reflect the multifaceted light of God's character with renewed clarity and brilliance. The peace was not being lessened. It was being perfected, polished, made ready to become the lens through which he would view the awakening world. The absolute physical stillness that had been a hallmark of his deepest sleep might have begun to yield in the most minute, almost immeasurable ways. A slight, unconscious shift in the placement of his arm beneath the woolen blanket, a barely perceptible deepening of his breath, as his lungs instinctively drew in the cool, fragrant air of the valley with a fraction more purpose. These were not signals of disturbed rest, but rather the initial subtle indications of a body that had been thoroughly rejuvenated and was now, in its own profound innate wisdom, commencing its slow, graceful preparation for the eventual return to movement and activity. It was like the first, almost invisible stirring of sap in the deepest roots of a dormant tree in late winter, a silent, potent harbinger of the vibrant life ready to surge upwards when the season turned. His muscles, having released every vestige of weariness, now lay in a state of quiescent readiness, imbued with a fresh, clean energy, awaiting the gentle internal summons to awaken. In this serene, transitional phase, as he drifted in the calm, luminous shallows just beneath the surface of full consciousness, any imagery that graced his inner world would continue to be gentle, affirming, and imbued with peace. Perhaps a fleeting, dreamlike sensation of standing in his seed archive, surrounded by the quiet, potent promise of countless sleeping lives, a profound sense of hope and continuity filling his heart, or the feeling of walking beside the clear, murmuring stream of Eldoria, its waters reflecting a sky of serene, benevolent blue, a quiet sense of companionship with the unseen Creator pervading his entire being. These were not the anxious, problem-solving dreams of a mind still wrestling with the day's complexities, but rather soft, comforting affirmations of his life's purpose, viewed now through the clarifying, beautifying filter of a spirit thoroughly cleansed and refreshed by divine grace. They were like the first tender notes of a beautiful melody, gently reawakening his soul to the harmonies of creation. The ancient, unwavering presence of the mountains that encircled Eldoria, though not consciously perceived, seemed to exert a subtle, grounding influence even upon his sleeping state. Their immense, silent strength was a palpable, reassuring reality, an unspoken reminder of endurance, of things that are eternal and unshakable. The stream's gentle, ceaseless song, an auditory thread woven through the very fabric of his existence in this valley, might now begin to register at a more subliminal level, not as a distinct sound, but as a comforting, rhythmic pulse. The very heartbeat of this secluded haven that was also, in a profound way, the rhythm of his own soul's peace. His profound disconnection from the external world was beginning its slow, almost imperceptible reversal, as his senses, one by one, fortified by rest, prepared to re-engage, but to do so from a place of deep, unassailable inner calm. Consider the biblical narrative of Jesus meeting Mary Magdalene in the garden on the morning of the resurrection. It was early, still dark, a time of profound grief transitioning into unimaginable joy. His first words to her were gentle, questioning, leading her from sorrow to recognition, from despair to hope. Elias, in his own far humbler way, approaching the dawn of his own consciousness, was not anticipating such a dramatic revelation, yet he was experiencing a deep, abiding sense of divine nearness, a quiet assurance that the God who had companioned him through the protective darkness of the night would also be his first, most welcome encounter in the light of a new day. This was not a peace that would flee with the shadows, but one that was intrinsically part of his being, ready to greet the morning sun alongside him. The profound sense of security, of being completely safe and tenderly enfolded in divine love, which had been the unshakable foundation of his night-long immersion in God's peace, remained absolutely firm. This was not a fragile tranquility, easily shattered by the first stirrings of the world outside. It was a deep, resilient calm, its foundations strengthened by hours of undisturbed communion with the sacred. This intrinsic security was the divine mechanism that would allow him to transition smoothly, peacefully into wakefulness without the jarring disorientation that can sometimes accompany a sudden return from the depths of sleep. He was being gently, lovingly acclimated, his spirit slowly recalibrating to the rhythms and frequencies of the waking world, all while being continuously cradled in that perfect, immutable serenity. Imagine a deep, artesian well, its waters crystal, clear, cool, and perpetually replenishing from an unseen, inexhaustible source. Even as water is drawn for daily needs, the well itself remains full, its life-giving supply fundamentally undiminished. Elias's spirit, having been filled to overflowing with the living water of God's peace throughout the long, restorative hours of the night, was now precisely in this state. As he began his slow, gentle ascent towards conscious awareness, he would be drawing upon this abundant inner resource, yet the source itself, the infinite, overflowing love and grace of God, remained eternally constant, ever available. This unspoken, deeply felt understanding contributed to the profound calm that accompanied his gradual emergence from the depths of his slumber. He knew, with a certainty that resided in the very marrow of his bones, that he would not awaken to a spiritual drought, but to an inner landscape that was fertile, vibrant, and abundantly watered. The deep darkness within his small stone cottage, undisturbed by any artificial light, was perhaps losing some of its most profound, inky intensity, subtly yielding to the almost imperceptible shift in the ambient light. Outside, as the earth continued its majestic, silent rotation towards the unseen sun. This was not a change he would consciously register, but his body's own exquisitely sensitive internal chronometers, perfectly attuned to the ancient natural cycles of light and darkness, would be responding to these minute environmental cues, gently guiding his physiology towards the waking state. The delicate hormonal symphony that had orchestrated his deep, restorative sleep was now slowly, precisely beginning to modulate, preparing the way for a natural, peaceful, and invigorating awakening. All of this complex, divinely designed activity was occurring beneath the surface of his tranquil repose, a masterful, silent preparation for his return to the world of light and purposeful action. The keeper of the ancient seeds, himself a precious seed of divine potential, rested on his slumber as profound and as peaceful as the ancient, slumbering valley that was his sacred charge. He was being meticulously prepared, not just to open his eyes to the physical light of a new day, but to meet that day with a spirit renewed, a heart at peace, and a body fully restored, ready to continue his quiet, faithful stewardship under the unwavering, loving gaze of the great keeper of all life. The transition from the hallowed stillness of the deepest night to the gentle, hopeful stirrings of the approaching dawn was as much an integral part of God's gift of profound rest as the deepest oblivion had been, a final, tender act of divine providence, ensuring a graceful and blessed return to the world. The gentle, almost imperceptible persuasion of the nearing dawn began to draw Elias with increasing, though still infinitely tender, insistence from the profoundest, most tranquil harbors of his valley. Sleep towards the familiar, sun-dappled shores of waking consciousness. The extraordinary, all-encompassing peace that had been his constant, silent companion throughout the long, restorative hours of the night did not diminish or recede. Rather, it felt as though it were consolidating within the very core of his being, transforming from a pervasive, ethereal mist of serenity into a quiet, steadily burning, luminous inner candle, a steadfast spiritual light that would soon illuminate his first perceptions of the dawning day. His body, while still enveloped in a state of profound, almost liquid relaxation, was beginning to lose the absolute, stone-like inertia that had characterized midnight's deepest surrender. A minute, unconscious adjustment in the way his head lay upon the fragrant pillow of dried meadow grasses, a barely perceptible quickening in the rhythm of his breathing as his lungs instinctively began to draw in the cool, pine and earth-scented air of the high valley with a fraction more intent. These were not signs of any disturbance to his rest, but the soft, initial stirrings of a physical vessel that had thoroughly and gratefully imbibed the sacred balm of profound sleep and was now, in its own unhurried, divinely timed cadence, preparing to re-engage with the world of sensation and movement. The great, silent, guardian mountains of Eldoria, their highest eastern-facing ramparts perhaps just beginning to catch the very first, almost invisible ethereal blush of the unrisen sun, stood as they had for countless millennia, timeless, sentinels witnessing the ancient sacred cycle of rest, renewal, and reawakening. And Elias, a humble integral part of this secluded, holy ecosystem, was moving in perfect unconscious accord with that eternal life-affirming rhythm. Imagine a master craftsman, a renowned sculptor, patiently and lovingly working on a magnificent piece of art from a block of flawless, pure white marble. Through the long, quiet hours of focused labor, they have chipped away all that is extraneous, smoothed every rough edge, and are now, as the first light of morning begins to illuminate their studio, gently polishing the revealed form, bringing forth its inherent breathtaking beauty, its profound silent eloquence. So, Elias's spirit, emerging from the divine studio of his night's sacred rest, felt not merely rested, but refined, its original God-given contours revealed with a new clarity, its capacity for reflecting the light of divine truth and love, subtly but significantly enhanced. The peace that had saturated his being was not simply a tranquil mood, it was a state of profound inner coherence, a harmonious alignment with his deepest spiritual identity, ready to inform his every thought, his every perception, his every action in the coming day. The journey back from the profound depths of sleep was not a jarring, abrupt ascent, but a graceful, almost melodic unfolding, each stage perfectly orchestrated by an unseen, infinitely wise and loving conductor. The subtle sounds from the world, beyond the thick stone walls of his cottage, which for many hours had been either entirely unheard or merely indistinct components of an undifferentiated nocturnal hum, began now to coalesce into more recognizable, though still beautifully distant, and unthreatening elements of his familiar environment. The chorus of the glacier-fed stream, Eldoria's constant liquid voice, might acquire a slightly more distinct articulate gurgle and flow as it made its way over ancient water-smoothed stones. The whisper of the wind in the high branches of the sentinel pines that guarded his valley might carry a clearer, more defined soughing, a more discernible ancient song. These sounds, still perceived through a thick, comforting veil of deeply ingrained peace, were not yet intrusions upon his inner stillness or demands upon his attention. They were more like gentle, familiar nudges from the periphery of his awareness, familiar elements of his world tenderly reintroducing their presence to his slowly awakening perception. His profound, almost symbiotic connection to this cherished valley, his keeper's innate attunement to its most subtle and nuanced language, was being lovingly, patiently re-established, thread by almost invisible thread. In this serene, luminous borderland, this exquisitely tranquil space suspended between the complete oblivion of deep sleep and the sharp, clear focus of full waking awareness, any ephemeral dream images or fleeting thoughts that might drift through his mind were gentle, peaceful, and imbued with a quiet sense of hope and sacred purpose. He might have a fleeting, sun-drenched vision of a field of perfectly tended, flourishing young seedlings in his experimental garden plots. their tender green shoots reaching eagerly towards the light, a silent promise of future abundance. Or perhaps he experienced the comforting, almost palpable sensation of walking through his beloved seed archive, surrounded by the quiet, potent promise of countless dormant lives, a profound sense of continuity, and the earth's enduring hope filling his heart with an ineffable quiet joy. These were not the agitated, problem-solving fragments of an unquiet, overburdened mind, but rather the soft, affirming afterglow of a spirit that had been thoroughly bathed in divine light and peace, its usual anxieties washed clean, its perspective restored to one of simple, unwavering trust in God's overarching plan. They were like the last, exquisitely beautiful, dissolving images of a sacred, luminous tapestry, their threads of peace and hope weaving themselves inextricably into the very fabric of his emerging, rested consciousness. The physical sensations of his immediate environment, the rough, soft texture of the hand-woven woolen blanket against his cheek, the way his pillow of dried grasses and lavender conformed perfectly to the curve of his neck and head, the distinct coolness of the mountain air on the small portion of his face left uncovered by the bedding were becoming increasingly vivid, more present and defined. These were no longer vague, distant, almost abstract impressions, but concrete, tangible sensory data that his brain, slowly and gently re-engaging its complex functions, was beginning to process with a calm, unhurried clarity, an almost involuntary, deep sigh, not of weariness but of profound, almost luxurious contentment, might escape his lips, a physical expression of the deep cellular well-being that permeated his entire being. His body, having been fully restored, rejuvenated, and replenished during the night's sacred processes, was now calmly, almost joyfully, communicating its readiness to embrace the new day, not with a jarring rush of adrenaline, but with a quiet, inherent, sustained vitality. The profound physical relaxation remained the baseline, but it was now animated by a subtle, nascent, purposeful energy, like a perfectly still, deep mountain lake, just before the first invigorating breath of the morning breeze stirs its pristine surface, sending gentle, hopeful ripples towards the shore. Consider the beautiful biblical imagery of the dew of Mount Hermon, descending silently and generously upon the mountains of Zion, a symbol of God's abundant, life-giving blessing and unity. Elias felt as though his entire being, his weary body, his sometimes troubled mind, his searching spirit, had been bathed, marinated, in such a divine, invisible dew throughout the long, peaceful watches of the night. He was awakening not to an inner landscape that felt parched, depleted, or barren, but to one that was verdant, refreshed, alive, and fragrant with the unmistakable sweet presence of his God. This was the fountain of living waters, spoken of by the prophets, springing up vigorously within him, a self-replenishing source of unending spiritual refreshment, profound resilience, and quiet, unshakable joy that would sustain him through all the known and unknown experiences of the day that was about to unfold. This was not merely a fleeting good mood, a temporary respite from life's pressures. It was a fundamental, qualitative reset of his entire being, a blessed return to his true spiritual center, where perfect peace, the peace of God, reigned supreme and unchallenged. The unwavering, extraordinary peace that had been his constant companion, his faithful guardian, and his protective sanctuary throughout the night now felt less like an external, bestowed gift, and more like an intrinsic, indivisible quality of his own spirit, as if his soul had not just been touched by it, but had completely absorbed its very essence, becoming one with it. This indwelling, resilient peace was his steadfast anchor, his unshakable foundation, as he neared the threshold of the waking world. It was truly the peace of God which surpasses all understanding, now acting as a wise, gentle, and vigilant gatekeeper, ensuring that his first conscious thoughts, his initial perceptions of the approaching day would be received into an atmosphere of serene acceptance, of profound gratitude, not into a chaotic flurry of renewed anxieties or the burdensome weight of recalled responsibilities. This was the enduring, transformative, and most precious gift of his night of utterly surrendered, divinely blessed rest, a profound qualitative change in his inner state that would, by God's continuing grace, inform and beautify his entire day and his engagement with all of creation. Imagine a masterfully crafted sailing vessel, having found safe, tranquil, and perfectly sheltered anchorage throughout a long, dark, and potentially stormy night, now gently, almost imperceptibly, rocking in the calm, crystalline waters of a hidden, sun-kissed cove as the first clear, golden light of a new dawn touches the still horizon. The memory of any past turbulence is forgotten, the weariness of the long voyage entirely erased, and there is only a profound sense of peaceful readiness, of eager anticipation for whatever the new day's journey under a clear sky may bring. Elias's spiritual journey through the night of profound sleep was now reaching this gentle, beautiful, and utterly peaceful conclusion. The deepest, most unplumbed waters of complete unconsciousness were now definitively behind him, and he was drifting with serene, effortless grace in the calm, luminous, sun-dappled shallows just off the welcoming shore of full, conscious awareness. His inner sails, which had been furled in trusting surrender, were not being hoisted with any sense of urgency or effort, but rather felt as if they were being gently, almost lovingly, filled by the first, soft, life-giving breezes of the Holy Spirit, preparing him to disembark with quiet joy and purposeful strength into the unfolding moments of a new and blessed day. His anchor of profound, God-given peace held him steady, serene, and secure as he prepared to step ashore. The profound, almost sacred silence within the rustic, stone-walled haven of his cottage was now subtly, beautifully different. It was no longer the absolute, almost breathless, nearly sepulchral silence of the deepest, darkest heart of the night, but the more expectant, vibrant, almost tingling hush of a world poised on the very brink of a glorious dawn, a silence that seemed to listen with eager anticipation for the first notes of creation's morning hymn. The subtle, life-affirming energies of the new day, of renewed creation, were undeniably gathering and growing in strength, both in the vast, awakening valley outside his small window, and within the deeply rested, fully restored core of his own being. The clean, crisp, uniquely invigorating scent of Eldoria in the genesis of morning, an exquisite, complex perfume of ancient pine resin, cool, damp earth, crushed wild herbs, and the unmistakable clean tang of rarefied mountain air, would be becoming more distinct, more discernible to his slowly, gently reawakening olfactory senses. A familiar, deeply beloved, and wonderfully welcoming aroma. His identity as Elias Thorne, the solitary, faithful keeper of the seed archive of Eldoria, a man whose life was an interwoven testament to simple, profound faith and quiet, steadfast resilience, was gently, joyfully re-emerging into his consciousness, not as a burdensome cloak of heavy responsibility, but as a cherished, well-loved, God-given calling, now to be approached with a spirit profoundly refreshed, entirely renewed, and overflowing with a peace that was truly beyond all earthly comprehension. The unseen, infinitely loving hand of the great gardener, the divine keeper of all life, which had guided him with such exquisite tenderness into the hidden sanctuary of profoundly restorative sleep, that had watched over him with unwavering, omniscient care through the darkest, most vulnerable hours of the night, was now just as gently, just as skillfully, just as lovingly, guiding him towards the clear, bright, hopeful light of a new and unblemished morning. There was no sense of being abruptly pushed or unwillingly pulled, only a natural, exquisitely graceful, organic unfurling, like a tightly closed mountain gentian, responding to the irresistible, life-giving summons of the sun's first warm caress. The deep, pervasive, and utterly comforting sense of having been cherished, protected, and unconditionally, eternally loved throughout his period of deepest vulnerability was the unshakable, granite-like bedrock upon which his confident, peaceful return to the world was being securely built. He was approaching the momentous act of consciously opening his eyes to the new day, not with any trace of reluctance, apprehension, or trepidation, but with a quiet, profound sense of joyful anticipation, a peaceful eagerness to embrace whatever the unfolding hours might hold, deeply and thoroughly fortified by a night of truly divine, miraculously life-giving rest. The final, exquisitely delicate, gossamer veils of sleep were now thinning to almost nothing, preparing to lift with the same ineffable tenderness and grace that had characterized his entire sacred nocturnal pilgrimage into the very heart of God's perfect, all-encompassing peace, revealing a world reborn, waiting to be met with a heart overflowing with gratitude, and a spirit bathed in the glorious, undiminished light of God's unending, unchanging love. The gentle yet undeniable summons of the fully dawning day, a call as ancient as creation itself, had now drawn Elias to the very luminous threshold separating the profound, restorative sanctuary of his sleep from the crisp, clear, invigorating awareness of the waking world. He lingered for a precious, suspended moment in this beautiful, liminal haven, not with any trace of reluctance to leave the embrace of his rest, but with a serene, almost joyful readiness, his entire being still profoundly saturated with the extraordinary tranquility that had been his constant, unwavering companion throughout the sacred, silent watches of the night. This peace felt less like a temporary, bestowed condition, and more like an intrinsic, reclaimed part of his very essence, a deep, quiet river of serenity flowing steadily through the landscape of his soul. His body, deeply rested, fully restored, and remarkably rejuvenated, lay in a state of perfect, relaxed equilibrium. Yet within that pervasive stillness, there was a subtle, unmistakable, nascent energy, a quiet, joyful hum of innate vitality, like a meticulously tended alpine garden in the cool, dew-kissed freshness of early morning, its myriad plants refreshed, vibrant, and eagerly poised to receive the sun's life-giving warmth and light. His breathing, still as even and as gentle as the softest zephyr sighing through the highest branches of the ancient sentinel pines, had acquired a subtle, almost imperceptible depth, a quiet, eager anticipation of the more conscious, deliberate, invigorating breaths of full, unclouded wakefulness. The great, silent, majestic peaks of Eldoria, their formidable eastern faces now fully ablaze with the direct, glorious kiss of the newly risen sun, stood as immutable, awe-inspiring witnesses to the daily, unending miracle of divine renewal. And Elias, a humble, faithful son of this hidden, sacred valley, was an integral, harmonious part of that timeless, life-affirming, sacred rhythm of rest, restoration, and joyful reawakening. He was poised on the brink of a new day, his spirit calm, his heart full, his entire being anchored in a peace that truly surpassed all earthly understanding. Imagine a master musician, a virtuoso of unparalleled sensitivity and skill, having lovingly and painstakingly restored an ancient, almost sacred stringed instrument, perhaps a cello crafted by a legendary maker centuries ago, now holding it with tender, almost reverent care, poised to draw forth its first, pure, resonant notes into the expectant, hallowed silence of a new morning. The instrument is not merely physically repaired. It feels as though its very soul has been reawakened, its seasoned, resonant wood retuned not just to musical perfection, but to a deeper, spiritual harmony, its strings vibrant with a new depth of tone, a new clarity of expression, ready to sing melodies that will touch both human hearts and the listening ear of heaven. So Elias's spirit, emerging with serene grace from the divine, restorative workshop of his night's sacred sojourn, felt not just comprehensively rested, but exquisitely retuned, its innate capacity for perceiving the subtle beauties of God's creation, for experiencing the profound depths of spiritual joy, for expressing the quiet strength of compassionate love, subtly yet significantly enhanced, its inherent, God-given harmony with its Creator restored to a purer, more vibrant, more resonant pitch. The profound peace that he had so deeply absorbed during the night was not merely a temporary cessation of inner anxiety or worldly turmoil. It was a profound, qualitative recalibration of his entire being, a blessed return to his true, divinely intended frequency of unshakable serenity and quiet, confident joy. This peace was the foundation, the keynote, of the beautiful, harmonious symphony his life was intended to be. The myriad sounds of the awakening valley of Eldoria were now distinct, clear, and wonderfully present, filtering through the sturdy stone walls of his humble cabin, not as jarring interruptions to his inner peace, but as the familiar, deeply cherished, and life-affirming melody of his daily, purposeful existence. The vibrant, complex chorus of the glacier-fed stream, Eldoria's liquid, musical soul, was now an articulate, joyful song of ceaseless movement, of irrepressible life, as it tumbled and danced its way over ancient, water-smoothed stones. The varied calls of the birds, the cheerful, almost conversational chirp of a family of sparrows nesting in the eaves of his cottage, the distant, sweet, fluting song of a solitary meadowlark welcoming the sun from a high pasture, the busy tapping of a woodpecker somewhere in the ancient orchard, were sharp, individual, and wonderfully clear, weaving a rich, vibrant tapestry of natural sound that spoke of God's abundant, diverse creation. Even the occasional soft, contented bleat from the flock of sheep in the nearby boma, now fully stirring with the bright promise of the new day, was a comforting, familiar, and reassuring note in this morning's symphony. His auditory senses, cleansed and sharpened by the night's profound rest, were fully re-engaging with his environment, but they were doing so from a place of deep, unshakable inner stillness, allowing him to receive these myriad beautiful sounds, not with a distracted or overwhelmed mind, but with a heightened sense of appreciation, a peaceful, joyful awareness of the world coming alive around him. In this serene, luminous margin, this beautiful, sacred space where the last, exquisitely fine veils of sleep were as thin and as translucent as the morning mist gently rising from the valley floor to greet the sun, any fleeting images or transient thoughts that arose in his mind were gentle, infused with light, and imbued with the profound, unshakable peace that had now become the very core of his being. He might see, with his inner eye, a single, perfectly formed dew-kissed spider web, strung like an impossibly intricate, delicate net of shimmering diamonds and pearls between two blades of tall meadow grass, a testament to nature's hidden artistry. Or perhaps the vivid, detailed image of a single ancient gnarled apple tree in his orchard, its branches laden with fragrant spring blossoms, a fragrant promise of future fruitfulness and God's continuing provision. These were not the demanding, intrusive, problem-laden thoughts of a mind still ensnared in the toils and anxieties of the previous day, but rather the quiet, deeply appreciative observations of a spirit that had been thoroughly bathed in divine beauty and light, its focus effortlessly shifted from the potentially burdensome to the abundantly grace-filled. They were like the first, exquisitely delicate, perfectly formed wild flowers of a new day, blossoming spontaneously and joyfully in the fertile, well-watered soil of his rested, grateful soul. The physical sensations of his immediate, familiar environment were now wonderfully vivid, intensely present, and deeply comforting. He could acutely feel the soft, slightly coarse, yet reassuring texture of the hand-woven woolen blanket against his skin, the way the firmly packed straw and fragrant dried herbs of his mattress conformed with perfect support to the contours of his rested body, the gentle, invigorating coolness of the high mountain morning air on his face and hands, A slow, deliberate, almost luxurious stretch might extend spontaneously through his limbs, a conscious, profoundly pleasurable reawakening of his physical being, an unspoken act of profound gratitude for its fully restored strength, its renewed flexibility, its inherent vitality. His body, having been completely and meticulously rejuvenated during the long sacred hours of the night's restorative processes, was now signaling its quiet, energetic, joyful readiness to embrace the myriad tasks and movements of the new day, not with a sense of reluctant obligation or weary duty, but with a cheerful, eager willingness to serve as the able and willing instrument of his renewed spirit. The profound, almost liquid relaxation remained the baseline of his physical state, but it was now wonderfully alive with a gentle, purposeful, and sustained vitality, like a deep, clear river gathering its powerful, quiet currents before flowing, with serene, unstoppable strength, towards the vast, welcoming sea. Consider the profound, almost mystical biblical passage where God, after forming man from the dust of the earth, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. While Elias was, of course, already a living soul, his emergence this morning from the deep transformative peace of his divinely gifted sleep felt, in a very real and personally significant way, like a miniature daily reenactment of that primordial divine impartation of life and consciousness. He was awakening not merely to another cycle of physical existence, but to a dramatically heightened, almost spiritually quickened sense of aliveness. His senses sharpened to an extraordinary degree, his spirit vivified, his heart filled to overflowing, with a quiet, incandescent joy that seemed to emanate from the very breath of God alive and active within him. This was the undeniable, transformative gift of true, sacred rest, not just a temporary, superficial reprieve from worldly weariness or mental fatigue, but a profound, holistic reinfusion of spiritual life force, a blessed resetting of his entire being to a state of greater intrinsic wholeness, unshakable peace, and joyful, purposeful vitality. The divine, pervasive peace that had been his protective, all-encompassing cloud by night, and his guiding, unwavering pillar of fire through the deepest watches of his slumber, now felt undeniably, wonderfully, joyfully, an intrinsic, inseparable part of his very being, like the very blood coursing warmly and life-givingly through his veins, like the very marrow deep within his strong, rested bones. It was no longer a fleeting, precious mood that he had to strive anxiously to maintain or fearfully protect from the harsh realities of the world, but rather the settled, natural, and unshakable climate of his soul, a priceless gift received, in utter humility and profound gratitude, and now possessed with a quiet, calm, unshakable confidence. As he hovered on the immediate luminous brink of consciously opening his eyes to the vibrant promise of the new day, this indwelling, God-given peace was the calm, clear, perfectly ground lens through which he would perceive his world, the steady, unfaltering, divinely calibrated compass by which he would navigate all its unfolding moments, both challenging and joyful. It was truly the shalom of God, that all-encompassing, holistic well-being of body, soul, and spirit, now acting as a wise, vigilant, and infinitely gentle guardian of his heart and his mind, ensuring that his first conscious engagement with the world would be one of profound peace, deep gratitude, and joyful, loving service. Imagine a tranquil, secluded mountain lake, its waters as clear as polished crystal, at the precise magical moment when the sun, a benevolent golden sovereign, majestically crests the highest eastern peaks, its glorious, life-giving light flooding the entire scene, instantly transforming the still reflective dark waters into a dazzling, breathtaking expanse of liquid, incandescent brilliance. The lingering mists of the departed night have utterly vanished, as if they had never been. The deepest shadows have fled in joyful surrender, and the entire world is revealed in its fresh, unspoiled, pristine glory, vibrant with color, alive, with sound, pulsating with renewed life. Elias's state of mind, his very soul, was now mirroring this magnificent, awe-inspiring natural event. The deepest, most profound immersion in the oblivion of sleep was definitively, blessedly past, and the clear, bright, invigorating light of full, unclouded waking consciousness was about to dawn gloriously within him. He was suspended for one last exquisite, precious moment in this beautiful, luminous, transformative interlude, where the profound, countless blessings of his night of sacred, restorative rest were fully and joyfully realized, and the robust, vibrant, irresistible invitation of the new day was a welcome, almost thrilling, divine call to renewed life and purposeful action. This was the perfect, serene, and wonderfully triumphant culmination of his nocturnal pilgrimage into the very heart of God's infinite, creative peace, a gentle, graceful, and yet powerfully invigorating arrival at the sunlit shores of a new beginning. The profound, almost tangible silence that had characterized the sacred sanctum of his humble stone cottage during the deepest, darkest hours of the night was now subtly but unmistakably replaced by a silence that was vibrant, alive, almost tingling with the expectant, joyful energies of the dawning morning. The fresh, clean, uniquely invigorating scent of his beloved Eldoria in the first flush of dawn, an exquisite, complex, and deeply comforting perfume of ancient resinous pine, cool, damp, life-giving earth, the crushed fragrance of wild, hardy herbs growing in the rocky crevices, and the clean, sharp, unmistakable tang of rarefied, pristine high mountain air, would be a distinct, potent, and wonderfully beloved aroma to his fully, joyfully reawakened olfactory senses. His identity as Elias Thorne, the solitary, humble, yet profoundly purposeful keeper of the ancient and sacred seed archive of Eldoria, a man whose entire life was an interwoven, living testament to simple, unshakable faith, and quiet, resilient, enduring strength, was now fully, clearly, and joyfully re-emerging into his conscious awareness, not as a heavy, burdensome cloak of overwhelming responsibility or daunting solitude, but as a cherished, precious, God-given calling, a sacred stewardship, now to be approached with a spirit profoundly refreshed, entirely renewed, and overflowing with a peace that was truly, wonderfully, gloriously beyond all fleeting earthly comprehension or description. The unseen, infinitely loving, and omniscient hand of the great shepherd, the divine gardener, the eternal keeper of all life and all seeds of potential, which had led him with such exquisite, unwavering tenderness into the hidden, fertile sanctuary of profoundly restorative sleep that had watched over him with ceaseless, omnipotent care through the darkest, most vulnerable watches of the long night, was now just as gently, just as skillfully, just as surely, and just as lovingly guiding him towards the clear, bright, hopeful, and promise-filled light of a new and unblemished morning. There was no sense whatsoever of being abruptly pushed, unwillingly pulled, or jarringly summoned. There was only a natural, exquisitely graceful, wholly organic unfurling of his consciousness, like a magnificent, tightly closed mountain bloom, responding with joyful eagerness to the irresistible, life-giving, warm caress of the sun's first benevolent rays, the deep, pervasive, and utterly comforting sense of having been cherished, protected, watched over, and unconditionally, eternally loved throughout his entire period of deepest, most vulnerable surrender, was the unshakable, granite-like bedrock, upon which his confident, joyful, and entirely peaceful return to the world was being securely and wonderfully built. He was approaching the momentous sacred act of consciously opening his eyes to the dawning of the new day, not with any lingering trace of reluctance, apprehension, or trepidation, but with a quiet, profound sense of joyful expectancy, a peaceful, eager willingness to embrace whatever the unfolding hours might hold, deeply and thoroughly fortified by a night of truly divine, miraculously life-giving, soul-saturating rest. The final, exquisitely delicate, almost invisible gossamer veils of sleep were now about to lift completely, with the same ineffable tenderness and profound grace that had characterized his entire sacred nocturnal pilgrimage into the very heart of God's perfect, creative, all-encompassing, and everlasting peace, revealing a world reborn, vibrant and new, waiting to be met with a heart overflowing with boundless gratitude and a spirit bathed in the glorious, undiminished, and life-transforming light of God's unending, unchanging, and ever-present love. With a soft, almost inaudible sigh, a breath not of weariness but of profound, soul-deep contentment and quiet, joyful anticipation, Elias opened his eyes. He was greeted not by a jarring intrusion of harsh light or the sudden, clamorous demands of the waking world, but by the gentle, diffused, golden rose radiance of the early morning sun, now beginning to stream with increasing warmth and cheerfulness through the small, deep-set window of his sleeping alcove, painting soft, luminous patterns on the rough-hewn stone walls of his humble dwelling. The transition from the serene, luminous borderlands of sleep to full, unclouded waking awareness was exquisitely seamless, a graceful, unhurried passage rather than an abrupt, disorienting arrival. His very first conscious perception was not of his familiar, rustic surroundings, nor of any immediate thought of the day's impending tasks, but of the extraordinary, unshakable peace that resided palpably within him, a deep, tranquil, artesian well of serenity, its surface undisturbed by even the faintest ripple of anxiety, doubt, or unease. It was the profound, intrinsic peace of a soul utterly and completely at rest, thoroughly and miraculously renewed by divine grace, a peace that felt as natural, as essential, and as integral to his very being as the steady, life-affirming beat of his own rested, grateful heart. He lay perfectly still for a few precious, suspended moments, consciously savoring this exquisite, almost tangible state of inner harmony, allowing the quiet, incandescent joy of it to permeate every cell, every fiber of his newly awakened consciousness, a silent, heartfelt offering of profound gratitude for the night's sacred, healing, and transformative grace. He became aware, with a gradually sharpening clarity, of the myriad sounds of his beloved valley of Eldoria awakening to vibrant life. All around him, these sounds were no longer muted, distant, or indistinct, as they had been on the peripheries of his sleep, but were now clear, crisp, distinct, and wonderfully present. Yet they were still received through the calming, beautifying filter of his profound inner serenity, the cheerful, intricate, almost conversational chorus of the countless birds nesting in the ancient trees and rocky crags outside his window, their songs a joyful, spontaneous hymn to the Creator of the new day. The gentle, rhythmic, almost musical murmur of the glacier-fed stream as it made its timeless, life-giving way over smooth, water-worn stones and around moss-covered boulders. Even the occasional soft, contented bleating from his flock of sheep in the nearby boma, now fully stirring and anticipating their release to fresh pastures. These were the familiar, deeply comforting, and utterly cherished sounds of his world, and today, in the wake of his profound rest, they seemed to hold a special, almost magical sweetness, a vibrant clarity that spoke eloquently of new beginnings, of life's irrepressible, God-given joy. His senses, meticulously cleansed, wonderfully sharpened, and exquisitely retuned by the night's sacred restorative processes, were keenly, joyfully alive, yet his mind remained a perfectly still, crystal-clear pond, reflecting these myriad, beautiful perceptions without being in the least agitated or overwhelmed by them. This, he knew, was one of the most precious gifts of a truly rested spirit, an almost miraculously enhanced capacity for pure, unadulterated appreciation, a peaceful, loving engagement with the world in all its glorious God-given detail. Slowly, with a sense of unhurried, almost reverent purpose, and with movements that were remarkably fluid, graceful, and easy for a man of his years and his life of physical labor, Elias sat up in his bed. There was absolutely no trace of stiffness in his limbs, no lingering, clinging grogginess in his mind, no shadowy residue of anxious dreams. Instead, he felt an invigorating, almost youthful lightness in his body, a quiet, sustained, joyful energy that seemed to spring forth effortlessly from a deep, inexhaustible internal wellspring of vitality. His clear, untroubled gaze fell upon the small, intricately carved wooden representation of a single perfect ear of wheat, a gift from a visiting botanist many years ago, a symbol of the earth's bounty and the promise held within every seed, that rested on the simple stone windowsill of his sleeping alcove. Today, in the soft morning light, it seemed to him to stand as a small, silent, yet powerfully eloquent testament to the unwavering faithfulness of the great sower, the divine husbandman, who had watched over him, the humble earthly keeper of seeds, through the long, dark, vulnerable hours of the night, and had brought him forth into a new day renewed and whole. A gentle, almost beatific smile touched his lips, a smile of profound, quiet understanding, of deep, unshakable faith, and of overflowing, heartfelt thankfulness. The almost formless anxieties and subtle melancholies that had briefly shadowed his thoughts the previous evening, before he had consciously and deliberately released them into God's care, now felt impossibly distant, like half-forgotten, insignificant tales from a faraway, irrelevant land, their power to distress or disturb him utterly and completely dispelled by the potent, unassailable reality of the perfect peace he now possessed, a peace that was as tangible as the mountain air he breathed. He rose from his simple bed, his bare feet finding the cool, familiar, grounding smoothness of the cabin's ancient stone floor. The simple, elemental act of standing, of feeling his own weight supported by the steadfast earth beneath him, felt good, reassuring, centering. He walked with a light, almost buoyant step to the small, deep-set window, pushing aside the simple, utilitarian sheepskin curtain that had covered it faithfully through the night. The hidden valley of Eldoria, his cherished sanctuary, lay before him in its full morning glory, bathed in the clear, bright, crystalline light of a new, unblemished day. The towering, majestic peaks that cradled his secluded home were sharply, magnificently defined against a sky of the most brilliant, cloudless, celestial blue. The high alpine pastures, still glistening with a million tiny diamonds of fresh morning dew, were a vibrant, welcoming, almost impossibly vivid green. The pure, rarefied mountain air that drifted gently in through the open window, cool, crisp, and heavily scented with pine resin and damp, fertile earth, was like a divine tonic, invigorating his senses, clarifying his mind, and filling his entire being with a sense of pristine, untainted purity. He breathed it in deeply, slowly, consciously, a deliberate act of welcoming the new day with all its potential, of receiving its myriad unspoken blessings with an open, receptive, and profoundly grateful heart. The almost overwhelming beauty of his beloved valley, a sacred beauty he had witnessed countless thousands of times over the course of his long life, seemed utterly new today, as if he were seeing it for the very first, astonished time with eyes that had been truly, miraculously washed clean by the healing waters of divine grace. His first conscious, articulated thoughts were not of the day's demanding litany of chores, nor of the meticulous responsibilities involved in the stewardship of his precious flock, and the even more precious seed archive, nor of any potential problems or unforeseen challenges that might arise to test his patience or his strength. Instead, a simple, profound, almost overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated gratitude washed over his entire being, so powerful, so intense, it almost brought a stinging moisture to his clear, observant eyes. It was a gratitude that encompassed everything, for the breathtaking, undeserved gift of life itself, for the inexhaustible, intricate beauty of God's magnificent creation that surrounded him in this hidden paradise, for the unwavering, unconditional, infinitely patient love and faithfulness of the God who had been his steadfast shield and his unfailing comfort through all the dark, silent watches of the night, and who was now so clearly, so undeniably, his radiant strength and his overflowing joy in the bright, hopeful promise of the new morning. He remembered with a fresh, poignant clarity the timeless words of the Scriptures that spoke of God's steadfast love never ceasing, his mercies never coming to an end, but being wonderfully, miraculously new every morning. And he felt the profound, life-altering truth of those ancient words resonating in the very deepest, most sacred chambers of his being, with an experiential certainty that transcended all intellectual understanding or theological formulation. This palpable peace, this invigorating strength, this crystal clarity of mind and spirit, these were tangible, freshly bestowed mercies, wholly undeserved yet so freely, so lavishly given. Great, oh great, is thy faithfulness, Lord God Almighty, he whispered, the simple, heartfelt words an almost involuntary echo of the prophet's ancient awe-filled song, his voice a little husky, a little thick with the potent emotion of a heart overflowing with love, gratitude, and reverent wonder. Still standing at the window, bathed in the warm, golden light of the early sun, he closed his eyes for a prolonged, intentional moment, not in any kind of formal, ritualistic prayer, but in a silent, deeply personal, wholly focused act of profound, inner communion with the divine. He consciously, deliberately offered the new, unblemished day, with all its unknown hours, its potential joys and its possible sorrows, back to its benevolent giver, humbly dedicating his every thought, his every unspoken intention, his every word, and his every subsequent action to God's loving service, to his greater glory. He asked with sincere humility for the quiet wisdom to be a good and faithful shepherd, both to his woolly flock and to any human soul he might encounter, for the enduring patience to meet any unforeseen challenges or frustrating obstacles, with grace and equanimity, for a heart that would remain ever open, ever sensitive, ever responsive to the subtle, gentle, often almost inaudible promptings of the Holy Spirit throughout all the unfolding moments of the hours ahead. It was a simple, unadorned prayer, born not of mere duty or ingrained religious ritual, but of a deep, abiding, all-consuming desire to live his entire life, in all its facets, in conscious, joyful, loving partnership with his Creator, his Redeemer, his Sustainer. This brief, silent yet intensely meaningful consecration of the new day was becoming an increasingly essential, non-negotiable part of his morning rhythm, a sacred bridge ensuring that the profound, holy peace of his restorative night would be carried forward, undiminished and undefiled, into the often demanding, sometimes profane, realities of his daily, work-filled existence. It was a conscious act of inviting the sacred serenity of his nocturnal sanctuary to bless, to inform, and to sanctify all the labors and interactions of his waking hours. He turned at last from the window, a quiet, serene sense of joyful purpose, now clearly animating his every movement, his every expression. The profound, almost tangible peace remained his unwavering foundation, his unshakable center, but it was now wonderfully tinged with a gentle, vibrant, optimistic energy, a calm, clear-eyed readiness to engage with all the tasks and responsibilities that awaited him. He moved towards the small, well-swept hearth, intending to add fresh wood to the glowing embers to prepare water for his morning infusion of wild herbs. But even this utterly simple, entirely routine daily action felt wonderfully different today. There was absolutely no lingering sense of drudgery, No familiar shadow of weariness at the mere thought of the day's long litany of physical labors. Instead, there was an almost eager, joyful anticipation of participating once more in the good, honest, deeply satisfying work that was not just his livelihood, but his life's sacred calling, his divine appointment in this hidden, blessed valley. He was not just reluctantly facing another long day. He was joyfully, gratefully stepping into another precious, God-given opportunity to experience and to witness God's intimate, loving presence in the world around him, to extend his compassionate care to the creatures entrusted to him, to live out his deeply held faith in the myriad small, tangible, practical ways that his unique shepherd's life so abundantly afforded. The various unspoken worries and half-formed concerns that had briefly, almost timidly, surfaced on the periphery of his thoughts the previous evening. The health of the aging ram, the condition of the more distant, leaner pastures, the unspoken, almost subconscious anxieties concerning his own advancing years, and the future stewardship of this sacred place, had not entirely vanished from the tablets of his memory, but they had utterly and completely lost their power to disturb his inner equilibrium, to chisel away at his profound peace. They were now held securely within a much larger, infinitely more comforting context of deep, unshakable trust, of a bone-deep knowing that he was not solely, ultimately responsible for every single outcome, for every possible eventuality, that a wisdom far greater, far more encompassing, far more ancient than his own was constantly, lovingly at work in his life and in the life of this entire valley. He would do his part, with all the diligence, faithfulness, and skill he possessed, but the ultimate results, the final, often unforeseen solutions, the overarching pattern of meaning and purpose, rested securely and eternally in God's infinitely capable, infinitely loving, and omniscient hands. This profound, liberating understanding was a precious, hard-won gift, allowing him to approach all his responsibilities, both great and small, with a remarkably lighter heart, a profoundly more peaceful mind, and a spirit unburdened by the illusion of ultimate control. As he gently coaxed the renewed embers in the hearth back to vibrant, cheerful life, watching the first small, eager flames begin to lick enthusiastically at the dry kindling he had carefully laid, he felt a deep, quiet, almost uncontainable sense of joyful, optimistic hope welling up from the deepest springs of his being. It was not a vague, insubstantial, wishful thinking kind of hope, but a solid, robust, thoroughly reasoned hope, deeply and unshakably rooted in the countless undeniable lived experiences of God's unwavering faithfulness throughout his long life in this valley. If his loving, omnipotent God could so consistently, so tenderly bring him through the deep, vulnerable darkness of every night with such profound, transformative peace and such complete, miraculous renewal, then surely, most surely, he could and would guide him with equal love and power through all the varied experiences of the bright, challenging light of every day, generously providing all that was truly necessary, both physically and spiritually, for each unfolding moment. This was not, he knew, a guarantee of an easy, carefree, trouble-free earthly existence. Life in a fallen world, even in a hidden paradise like Eldoria, was rarely so simple. But it was an absolute, unshakable assurance of constant, loving companionship, of unfailing, unconditional love, of ever-present, all-sufficient grace. And with that glorious, life-affirming assurance burning brightly and warmly in his heart, Elias Thorne, the humble, faithful keeper of the seeds of Eldoria, felt ready, profoundly, joyfully, and peacefully ready, to embrace the new day with all its potential, his heart filled to overflowing with a peace that was as vast, as serene, and as enduring as the ancient, majestic mountain valley that was his cherished, God-given home. The precious, sacred gift of his night's profound sleep had been fully, gratefully received, and its manifold, transformative blessings were now the quiet, luminous, unshakable foundation upon which he would joyfully, faithfully build all the unfolding hours of the day to come. The freshly kindled fire in the stone hearth now crackled with a cheerful, vibrant energy, sending dancing, playful shadows across the rough-hewn, time-silvered wooden walls of Elias's small, rustic cabin, and filling the enclosed space with a welcoming, comforting warmth that effectively dispelled the last lingering vestiges of the High Valley's pre-dawn chill. The seed keeper himself moved with a quiet, almost reverent, deliberate grace, his actions unhurried yet infused with a surprising youthful efficiency, as he prepared his simple morning repast, a small earthenware pot of wild mountain berry, tea now steeping gently beside the dancing flames, its fragrant, fruity steam mingling pleasantly and invigoratingly with the clean, sharp aroma of burning pine and the ever-present subtle incense of ancient wood smoke that permeated his dwelling. The profound, almost tangible peace that had so completely saturated his entire being during his long, restorative night of sacred, divinely gifted sleep was not some fleeting, ethereal memory gradually fading with the advancing light of day. Rather, it was a living, breathing, dynamic presence residing powerfully within him, subtly yet profoundly coloring his every perception, gently yet definitively informing his every thoughtful movement, his every considered action. It felt as though the serene, almost mystical stillness of the hidden Eldoria Valley at the deepest hour of midnight, under a canopy of silent, witnessing stars, had somehow taken up permanent, joyful residence within the most sacred chambers of his soul, a tranquil, inexhaustible reservoir of calm strength and quiet joy, from which he could draw freely and abundantly throughout all the unfolding moments of the coming day. His hands, though visibly weathered, calloused, and strong from countless decades of a seed-keeper's often demanding physical labor in all seasons, felt remarkably supple, agile, and wonderfully responsive this morning, his entire body feeling surprisingly light, almost buoyant, and filled to overflowing with a quiet, steady, sustainable energy that was a direct, undeniable inheritance of the night's profound, holistic renewal. He poured the fragrant, ruby-red tea into a simple, treasured earthenware mug, its surface warmed by the heat of the brew, and carried it to the sturdy, handmade wooden table that stood near the open cabin door. He sat on a simple, three-legged stool, its wood worn smooth and dark by generations of keepers before him, positioning himself so that he could feel the fresh, crisp, invigorating mountain morning air on his face and witness the first direct, golden rays of the newly risen sun as they began to spill over the formidable eastern mountain peaks, flooding his secluded valley with a clear, bright, life-affirming light. The entire valley of Eldoria outside his humble dwelling was now fully alive, vibrant and pulsating with the myriad sounds and glorious sights of a pristine, unblemished new day. His flock of sheep were already stirring with eager anticipation. In the boma, their occasional soft, almost conversational bleats, forming a gentle pastoral chorus against the backdrop of the wider natural symphony. Countless unseen birds sang with an almost ecstatic, unrestrained joy from their hidden perches in the ancient, surrounding pines and the gnarled apple trees of his small orchard, their complex melodies a spontaneous, heartfelt hymn of praise to the Creator. The ever-faithful stream, the liquid lifeblood of his valley, sparkled and gurgled with renewed vigor as it hurried on its timeless, joyous journey towards unseen destinations. Elias observed all this magnificent, unfolding pageant of life with a profound, almost overwhelming sense of quiet, heartfelt appreciation, his entire being filled with a deep, pervasive, and utterly tranquil gratitude. The world around him felt freshly new-minted, wonderfully pristine, almost divinely recreated, and his own spirit, so thoroughly cleansed, wonderfully sharpened, and profoundly renewed by the night's sacred transformative rest, resonated in perfect joyful harmony with this fresh, vibrant, irrepressible sense of God-given life. the almost formless anxieties and subtle melancholic shadows that had briefly, almost hesitantly, flickered on the periphery of his thoughts the previous evening before his conscious surrender to divine care, now seemed completely, utterly, and almost miraculously dispersed, like insignificant wisps of morning mist vanishing without a trace in the clear, bright, unwavering light of the profound, unshakable peace he now so joyfully and gratefully possessed. He thought with renewed clarity and deep personal conviction of the ancient, timeless words of Scripture that speak with such profound assurance of God's steadfast covenant love never ceasing, His tender, compassionate mercies never, ever coming to an end, but being wonderfully, gloriously, almost unbelievably new every morning. This was not, for Elias, merely a beautiful, poetic, theological concept to be pondered intellectually or recited liturgically. It was a vibrant, pulsating, deeply lived and consistently experienced reality, as tangible and as undeniable as the warm sun on his face or the solid earth beneath his feet. The profound, all-encompassing peace that now filled every fiber of his being. The surprising, youthful strength that coursed through his rested limbs. The crystal clarity and keen focus that illuminated his awakened mind. These were all tangible, freshly bestowed, wholly undeserved divine mercies poured out upon him anew with the dawning of this glorious day. He felt a profound, almost humbling sense of being utterly and completely provided for, not just in the obvious terms of his physical sustenance, abundantly available from his garden, his flock, and the bounty of the valley, but in the far deeper, often unspoken, yet infinitely more critical needs of his immortal soul. The profound rest he had received during the night was not merely a necessary biological function, a simple respite from physical fatigue. It had been a deeply spiritual transaction, a sacred alchemical exchange of his human weariness for God's divine strength, his earthly anxieties for God's heavenly peace, his personal depletion for God's inexhaustible overflowing fullness. And this daily, often moment-by-moment, miraculous provision of grace was for him a source of constant, reverent wonder, a foundation for unshakable, childlike trust, and a catalyst for unending, heartfelt gratitude. After finishing his fragrant, invigorating morning tea, his spirit calm and his senses keenly alive to the beauty surrounding him, Elias began the familiar, cherished routines of his long-established shepherd's day. His very first act, an unvarying ritual born of deep responsibility and genuine affection, was always to go and personally check on the well-being of his beloved flock. He approached the sturdy, well-maintained boma, his faithful old border collie, Shep, trotting with quiet dignity and unwavering loyalty at his heels, while young, energetic Bess, her kelpie exuberance barely contained, was already bounding ahead, with joyful anticipation, her tail a blur of happy motion. The sheep, recognizing his familiar silhouette, his scent, his gentle voice, immediately gathered with trusting eagerness near the simple wooden gate, their soft, intelligent, amber-colored eyes fixed upon him with an almost palpable affection and complete unwavering reliance. He moved slowly and deliberately among them, his presence a calming, reassuring influence, his weathered hands gently yet expertly examining a slightly swollen joint on an older ewe here, checking the condition of a thick, lanolin-rich fleece. There, speaking to them all the while in low, soothing, almost crooning tones, a pastoral language of affection and care that they seemed to instinctively understand and respond to. His interactions were entirely unhurried, his attention fully focused on each individual animal, his touch gentle yet firm. The profound peace that now resided so deeply within him allowed him to be completely, wholly present to these humble, dependent creatures, to minister to their many small needs with a remarkable patience, a boundless kindness, and a tender compassion that flowed effortlessly and naturally from his own thoroughly replenished, grace-filled spirit. He was not just their pragmatic keeper, their necessary provider of food and shelter. He was their true shepherd, in the deepest, most biblical sense of that sacred word, reflecting in his own small, imperfect yet sincere way, the boundless, tender, compassionate care of the great shepherd, the Lord of all flocks, both earthly and heavenly. He paid particular, gentle attention to the old, venerable ram, whose slight, intermittent lameness had caused him a measure of quiet concern the previous evening. Today, to his immense relief and quiet joy, the noble animal seemed to be moving. With noticeably greater freedom, the subtle swelling around the affected joint visibly, almost miraculously, reduced. Elias felt a quiet, profound sense of peaceful relief, a gentle, almost unspoken affirmation that his heartfelt concerns, once consciously and deliberately surrendered into the hands of a higher, wiser power, were indeed being attentively and lovingly tended to by a wisdom and a benevolence far beyond his own limited human capacity. He didn't necessarily attribute this improvement to any sudden, dramatic, supernatural intervention, but rather to the intricate, divinely designed natural processes of healing and restoration, perhaps significantly aided by the complete rest the animal had received during the night, and by the quiet, humble, trusting prayer that he, the earthly shepherd, had offered on its behalf. It was, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively small, almost insignificant event. Yet it served to powerfully reinforce his deeply held conviction that when he faithfully, diligently did his own small part, and then completely, unreservedly, entrusted the final outcome to God's infinite wisdom and perfect timing, things often, almost invariably, resolved themselves in ways he could never have cleverly foreseen or skillfully orchestrated. This profound experiential understanding was one of the unshakable cornerstones of his remarkably peaceful, resilient approach to the inevitable, often unpredictable challenges and vicissitudes of his long and solitary shepherd's life in this wild, beautiful valley. Leading his beloved flock out from the secure confines of the boma, Caleb, or rather Elias, for this is his story now, began the slow, deliberate, almost meditative, meandering journey towards the higher alpine pastures, where the grazing was always richest, most succulent, and most nourishing, especially after the refreshing dew of a cool mountain night. The sun, now climbing with majestic grace higher in the clear azure sky, warmed his back with its benevolent rays, and the crisp valley air was filled to overflowing with the clean, invigorating, earthy scent of dew-damp grasses, crushed wild flowers, and the distant, resinous perfume of ancient, sun-warmed pine needles. He walked with a steady, even, almost rhythmic stride, his well-worn shepherd's crook held comfortably in his hand, not as a weapon of defense or an instrument of coercion, but as a familiar, trusted tool of gentle guidance, of subtle persuasion, of reassuring presence. His two loyal dogs, Shep and Bess, instinctively knowing their responsibilities, their places in this ancient pastoral ballet, moved with a quiet, almost preternatural efficiency, their bodies low to the ground, their movements fluid and purposeful, keeping the slowly moving flock cohesively together, gently, almost invisibly, nudging any wayward, curious stragglers back towards the safety and companionship of the main group. There was a profound, almost sacred, timeless rhythm to this daily, seasonal procession, a pastoral ritual as ancient and as enduring as shepherding itself, and Elias felt a deep, almost mystical sense of profound connection to that long, unbroken, venerable line of men and women who had, throughout millennia, faithfully tended their flocks, who had lived in such intimate daily communion with the earth and all its varied creatures, who had learned, through generations of patient observation and lived experience, to read the subtle, intricate, sacred language of the changing seasons, the shifting winds, and the silent, expressive sky. As he walked thus, his spirit calm, and his senses keenly, alive to the unfolding beauty of his surroundings, his mind was not filled with a distracting cacophony of anxious thoughts, mental to-do lists, or the burdensome residue of past regrets or future fears. Instead, it was remarkably, wonderfully still, calm, and deeply observant, peacefully taking in the myriad subtle wonders of his valley home. The breathtaking way the bright morning sunlight filtered with an almost ethereal glory through the delicate trembling leaves of the quaking aspen trees that lined the lower slopes, transforming them into a shimmering, incandescent cascade of living gold coins. The intricate, almost calligraphic patterns of multi-hued lichen adorning an ancient, majestic moss-covered granite boulder that stood like a silent, solitary sentinel beside the winding path. The distant, awe-inspiring, almost effortless flight of a solitary golden eagle as it circled with supreme, majestic grace on the invisible thermal currents high above the valley floor, its keen, all-seeing eyes patiently scanning the vast terrain below. The profound, all-encompassing peace that he had so gratefully received during the long restorative hours of the previous night had not in any way dulled his senses or made him oblivious to the world around him. On the contrary, it had wonderfully, almost miraculously, heightened them, allowing him to perceive the intricate beauty and profound sacredness of his familiar surroundings with a dramatically increased depth of appreciation, a renewed sense of childlike wonder, and a tender, loving awareness that enabled him to see the unmistakable divine fingerprints of the omnipotent, benevolent Creator in even the smallest, most seemingly insignificant details of his magnificent, infinitely varied creation. This was not a passive, disengaged, dreamy state of detachment from reality. It was a state of profoundly active, intensely joyful, and deeply appreciative awareness, a blessed way of seeing and being in the world. He found himself, quite unconsciously, humming a quiet, simple, almost tuneless melody, a soft, contented sound much like the gentle, soothing murmur of the nearby stream that accompanied him on his upward journey, or the distant, peaceful sigh of the wind in the highest branches of the ancient pines. It was not a conscious, deliberate act of musical expression, but rather a spontaneous, irrepressible, joyful overflowing of the deep, pervasive contentment that now filled his grateful heart to the very brim. The usual, often relentless, internal dialogue, the constant stream of self-talk that can so often be harshly critical, needlessly anxious, or wearisomely repetitive, was blessedly, wonderfully silent. In its place was a profound, abiding, almost tangible sense of holistic well-being, a quiet, incandescent joy that needed no external stimulus, no specific worldly cause for its existence, other than the simple, yet utterly profound, reality of being fully, joyfully alive, of being perfectly, unshakably at peace, of being in constant, conscious, loving fellowship with his God. This, he knew with a certainty that resonated in the deepest core of his being, was truly the peace of God which surpasses all understanding, a peace that was not in any way dependent on fleeting external circumstances or favorable worldly conditions, but flowed with ceaseless, life-giving abundance from a deep, internal, inexhaustible spiritual spring constantly, miraculously replenished by the ever-present overflowing grace of his loving, faithful God. The well-worn path to the high alpine pastures was undeniably steep and challenging in several places, requiring considerable physical effort, careful attention to his footing, and a patient, steady persistence. Yet even as he exerted himself physically, navigating the rocky inclines and the narrow, sometimes treacherous ledges, Elias felt no sense of undue strain, no premature onset of weariness, no complaining resistance from his rested body. The remarkable, quiet strength that had been so thoroughly and wonderfully renewed within him during the long, sacred hours of the previous night was proving itself to be more than merely adequate for all the varied physical demands of this new day. He paced himself with the innate wisdom of long experience, breathing deeply and rhythmically, his movements remarkably economical, inherently graceful, and entirely sure-footed, qualities born not just of familiarity with the terrain, but of a body and spirit working in perfect harmonious accord. He was not resignedly fighting against the rugged challenges of the steep terrain, but rather moving in graceful, almost joyful harmony with it, his rested, willing body a capable, responsive, and efficient instrument of his peaceful, purposeful spirit. And interwoven with this sustained, surprisingly easy physical exertion was a continuous, quiet, deeply comforting sense of God's immediate loving presence, a profound feeling that he was not alone on this solitary, sometimes arduous journey, that his every upward step was being subtly accompanied, his every sustained effort was being gently supported, by a strength, a wisdom, and a love far greater, far more ancient, than his own. The humble earthly shepherd was faithfully, lovingly leading his trusting flock upwards towards nourishment and safety. But he himself, in a deeper, more significant way, was also being gently, powerfully, and unerringly led by the great, good shepherd of his own soul. The hidden, beautiful valley of Eldoria was not just his physical home, his place of daily labor. It was his spiritual sanctuary, his sacred classroom, his most cherished place of intimate, life-sustaining communion with the divine, and the profound, unshakable peace that he consistently found there, especially in the clear, bright aftermath of a night of deep, restorative, God-given rest, was its most precious, its most beautiful, its most profoundly life-giving and soul-nourishing spiritual resource. The expanse of the high alpine meadow, a breathtaking tapestry of vibrant emerald grasses generously interwoven with the jewel-like colors of myriad hardy wildflowers, sapphire blues, ruby reds, amethyst purples, and sun-bright yellows, unfolded before Elias and his peacefully grazing flock under a vast, overarching sky of the most intense, almost incandescent, cerulean blue. He settled himself comfortably on a large, sun-warmed slab of ancient granite, its surface smoothed and sculpted by millennia of wind, rain, and ice, its steadfast presence a tangible symbol of enduring, unshakable strength. With his back resting against the reassuring solidity of a moss-covered outcrop, and his well-worn shepherd's crook laid carefully beside him, he could survey not only his entire flock as they spread out contentedly across the lush pasture, but also the magnificent, almost overwhelming panorama of his beloved Eldoria Valley cascading in soft undulating folds far below, its intricate patchwork of dense, dark green coniferous forests, meandering silver-threaded streams, and smaller jewel-like sun-dappled meadows stretched seemingly endlessly towards the distant, mist-shrouded, almost ethereal western peaks that formed the valley's majestic, protective outer rim. The air at this high altitude was noticeably thinner, wonderfully crisp, and carried the clean, invigorating, almost spiritual fragrance of countless tiny alpine blossoms, the sharp, resinous perfume of wind-stunted, tenacious pines, and the faint, cool, damp scent of recently melted snowfields from the even higher, unseen crags. It was a place of immense, profound, almost sacred silence, a silence broken only by the soft, rhythmic, almost meditative tearing sound of his sheep diligently grazing, the occasional joyful, exuberant bark of young, irrepressible Bess as she, playfully, harmlessly chased a fluttering, iridescent butterfly, or the gentle, almost inaudible sigh of the high mountain wind as it swept with a soft, caressing touch across the vast, open expanse of the meadow. Here, in this rarefied atmosphere, so much closer to the immensity of the sky, so much more removed from the cluttered concerns of the lower world, Elias always felt a dramatically heightened, almost palpable sense of God's awe-inspiring majesty, his intricate creative artistry, and his intimately personal, tenderly loving presence. The profound, unshakable peace that had been his constant, unwavering companion since his blessed awakening that morning felt even more expansive, more deeply and securely rooted, more gloriously liberating in this place of wild, untamed, unspoiled, almost primal beauty. This was, for him, holy ground. He watched his sheep with a shepherd's knowing, loving eye, each individual animal known to him not just by its appearance, but by its unique personality, its ingrained habits, its particular quirks, and endearing foibles, qualities as familiar and as dear to him as the lines on his own weathered hands. There was old, wise Deborah, the undisputed matriarch of the flock, her gaze always calm and watchful, her movements dignified and deliberate. There was young, impetuous Samson, his fleece still thick and curly, always bold, endlessly inquisitive, often the first to explore a new patch of pasture. And there was quiet, gentle Ruth, who seldom strayed far from the comforting presence of her sturdy, playful lamb, her soft bleats a constant murmur of maternal affection. He felt a deep, abiding, almost paternal affection for these simple, trusting creatures, a true shepherd's love that was simultaneously profoundly protective, infinitely patient, and exquisitely tender. Their complete, unquestioning trust in him, their utter childlike dependence on his diligent care for their every need, for food, for water, for safety, for guidance, was a constant, deeply humbling, and wonderfully instructive reminder of his own far greater and equally necessary dependence on the wisdom, the provision, and the unwavering love of the great shepherd of all souls. He knew, with a job-like humility born of long experience, that he was far from a perfect shepherd in his tending of them, that he often made mistakes of judgment, that his human patience sometimes wore frustratingly thin, that his understanding was always limited. Yet, despite his acknowledged frailties, he always, consistently, strove to be faithful to his calling, to provide for them to the very best of his ability, to keep them safe from all harm, to lead them unfailingly to good, nourishing pasture, and in that sincere, often arduous striving, however imperfect his execution might sometimes be, he found a profound, quiet sense of purpose, a deep, unshakable dignity, a reason for being that transcended the mere mechanics of survival. As the sun climbed with majestic slowness towards its noonday zenith, casting dramatically shortened, almost non-existent shadows across the high meadow, Elias drew from his sturdy, time-softened leather satchel, a satchel that had accompanied him on countless thousands of such pastoral journeys, a small, much battered, well-loved copy of the Book of Psalms, its pages thin, almost translucent, and deeply browned by decades of devoted handling, along with his simple, customary midday meal, a substantial hunk of dry, dark rye bread, a wedge of sharp, crumbly goat cheese, and pungent, locally gathered wild onions. He ate slowly, with a deliberate, mindful enjoyment that transformed the humble fare into a veritable feast, his appreciative gaze sweeping with serene contentment across the breathtaking, peaceful scene bathed in the brilliant alpine sunlight. The coarse, slightly sour bread, baked by his own hands in the small stone oven beside his cabin, tasted wonderfully wholesome and deeply satisfying in the clear, crisp mountain air. The sharp, tangy cheese, a gift from a grateful farmer whose lost ewe he had once found and returned, was a welcome, piquant treat. He drank deeply from his sheepskin water skin, the cool, pure, almost sweet spring water, drawn that morning from the headwaters of the Eldoria stream, wonderfully refreshing and intensely pure. These were simple, elemental provisions, devoid of all worldly sophistication or culinary pretense, yet they felt like a king's banquet to him, enjoyed as they were in this magnificent, awe-inspiring natural cathedral, far removed from the distracting clamor, the artificial complexities, and the often empty promises of a wider world he only rarely visited, and about which he sometimes heard unsettling reports from the occasional passing traders or wandering pilgrims who sought shelter in his valley. His contentment was profound, almost sublime, a quiet, unassailable joy that needed no external validation, no sophisticated worldly pleasures for its sustenance. It was the deep, intrinsic joy of a man completely, utterly at peace with himself, with his solitary yet fulfilling work, with the wild, beautiful world that was his home, and most importantly, with his ever-present, ever-loving God. This sustained, unwavering peace, this quiet, radiant joy, he knew with absolute certainty, was a direct, blessed outflow, a continuing miraculous dividend, from the deep, profoundly restorative, divinely gifted rest that the Lord, in his infinite mercy, had so generously granted him the previous night. He opened the tattered, precious book of Psalms, its pages falling, open almost automatically to a passage whose words were as familiar and as comforting to him as the contours of his own valley. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. He read the ancient, powerful words, not as a theologian dissecting a complex, archaic text, nor as a literary critic analyzing poetic structure or metaphorical nuance, but as a simple, humble man of the mountains who had, for his entire life, lived in intimate, daily proximity to the very glories these verses so eloquently described. This hidden valley, these majestic, silent mountains, the vast, star-strewn sweep of the night sky, these had been his most profound, most constant, most revelatory schoolhouse. It was here, in the midst of God's untamed, unspoiled creation, that he had learned firsthand, with an experiential depth that transcended all book learning, of God's infinite power, his intricate wisdom, his boundless creativity, his unwavering faithfulness, and his incomprehensible, tender love. These were not for Elias merely abstract theological doctrines or comforting religious platitudes. They were the lived, deeply felt, unshakable experiential cornerstones of his simple, yet profound faith, the very bedrock of the extraordinary, resilient peace that now filled every fiber of his being, a peace that felt as solid and as enduring as the ancient granite outcrop upon which he sat. This peace was his inheritance, his strength, his song. He thought of the prophet Moses, who had spent 40 long, arduous years leading the often rebellious and stiff-necked people of God through a vast, inhospitable, and terrifying wilderness, sustained through it all not by his own strength or wisdom, but by a tangible guiding divine presence that manifested as a mysterious pillar of cloud by day and an awesome pillar of fire by night. Eldoria, his beloved valley, was certainly no threatening wilderness in that harsh, forbidding sense. It was, for him, a place of abundant life, of breathtaking beauty, of profound peace and spiritual sustenance. Yet, Elias understood, with a wisdom born of long, solitary contemplation, that every human life, regardless of its external circumstances, has its own unique stretches of inner wilderness to traverse, its own challenging times of spiritual dryness, of gnawing uncertainty, of feeling lost, alone, or overwhelmed by the sheer weight of existence. And what sustained one through those inevitable, often painful, shadowy periods was not mere human ingenuity, fierce self-reliance, or stoic endurance alone, but rather the quiet, unwavering, often almost imperceptible assurance of that divine, guiding pillar, that inner light, that steadfast presence, that still, small voice, which offers guidance when the path ahead is shrouded in obscurity and comfort, when the way seems impossibly difficult or unbearably lonely. The profound, robust, and wonderfully resilient peace that was so palpably his today, a peace that felt as if it could withstand any storm, was, he knew, the direct, blessed result of his own consistent, lifelong choice to follow that inner, divine pillar, of habitually, trustingly surrendering his will to that unseen, yet utterly reliable guidance, even when the reasons were unclear or the personal cost seemed high. The deep, transformative rest of his preceding night had served to dramatically clear his inner vision, allowing him to perceive that sacred guiding light with a renewed, almost startling clarity, and to follow its promptings with a fresh, joyful, and unhesitating obedience. A fleeting, dark shadow, large and swift, passed momentarily across the sun-drenched meadow. Elias instinctively looked up, his shepherd's senses instantly alert, to see a magnificent golden eagle, its wings spread wide and powerful, soaring with an almost regal, effortless grace on the invisible thermal currents high above, its incredibly keen telescopic eyes patiently, methodically scanning the vast valley floor far below, searching for its next meal. He watched its majestic, silent flight for a long, appreciative moment, seeing in it a powerful, unspoken sermon in the boundless blue sky. A sermon about inherent freedom, about breathtaking perspective, about the exquisite, awe-inspiring beauty of a creature perfectly, divinely designed for its unique element, living out its existence in entire, unconscious, joyful accord with its created purpose and God-given instincts. There was absolutely no sense of striving, no wasted effort, no anxious uncertainty in its powerful, soaring flight, only a serene, confident, graceful mastery of its airy domain. Elias felt a deep, almost poignant kinship with that magnificent, solitary bird, not in its sheer grandeur or its predatory prowess, but in the quiet, persistent longing of his own soul for that same kind of effortless, joyful alignment with God's perfect will for his own life, that same glad, unreserved embracing of his own unique, divinely appointed purpose in this hidden valley. And he knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within his rested, peaceful spirit, that the profound, all-encompassing peace he now so abundantly experienced was an absolutely essential key to achieving that longed-for alignment. For when the human soul is truly, deeply at rest in God, it becomes infinitely more sensitive, more receptive, more easily guided by the gentle, subtle, often almost inaudible currents and whispers of the Holy Spirit. The warm, sun-drenched afternoon hours passed by in a slow, serene, almost timeless rhythm. The flock of sheep grazed with a deep, bovine contentment, their munching a soft, pervasive, almost meditative sound, occasionally punctuating their feeding to rest for a while in the cool, welcome shade of a wind-stunted, hardy alpine pine or a massive, lichen-covered granite boulder. Young Bess, her irrepressible youthful exuberance temporarily sated by her earlier playful antics, now dozed contentedly at his feet, her paws twitching occasionally as she chased dream butterflies through an imaginary meadow. Old, wise Shep, ever the vigilant guardian, maintained a quiet, dignified, almost regal watch from a slightly elevated position, his keen, intelligent gaze sweeping with slow, methodical regularity across the perimeter of the broad meadow, alert to any sign of potential danger or disturbance. Caleb himself sometimes closed his own eyes, not to succumb to sleep, for his body was still pleasantly energized, but to simply, profoundly bask in the comforting, therapeutic warmth of the high-altitude sun on his weathered face, to feel the gentle, cooling caress of the alpine breeze as it whispered secrets through his graying hair, to listen with his inner ear to the profound, almost palpable silence of the high country, a silence that was not empty or void, but richly, intensely full of the unspoken, yet overwhelmingly powerful and loving presence of his God. In these precious, suspended, almost mystical moments, there was absolutely no separation, no distinction between prayer and simple being, between deep contemplation and quiet, joyful existence. His very stillness, his peaceful, receptive posture, was a profound form of unspoken worship. His serene, unshakable contentment, a silent, heartfelt hymn of grateful praise to the giver of all good gifts. The deep, inexhaustible well of divine serenity that had been so abundantly filled during the restorative miracle of the previous night was still demonstrably, wonderfully overflowing, its life-giving waters irrigating every part of his being. He noticed, with a sudden surge of quiet delight, a small, incredibly fragile, exquisitely beautiful, alpine forget-me-not, its tiny blossoms a vivid, almost startling splash of the purest, most intense sky blue, growing with tenacious courage in a narrow, almost invisible crevice of the massive granite rock beside him. How, he marveled, had such a delicate, almost ethereal thing found purchase, found life, in such an apparently inhospitable, barren place? How did its tiny, unseen roots draw sufficient sustenance from the bare, unyielding stone? It was, he knew, a tiny, perfect, breathtaking miracle. A silent, eloquent testament to the incredible, irrepressible tenacity of God-given life, to the boundless, astonishing creative power of the Almighty, who could bring forth such delicate, vibrant beauty even in the seemingly harshest, most unpromising environments. He reached out a calloused, gentle finger and very lightly, almost reverently, touched one of its impossibly delicate, velvet-soft petals. It was a powerful, poignant reminder to him that true strength, lasting resilience, and enduring spiritual beauty were not always, or even often, about impressive size, overt physical power, or worldly dominance, but were much more frequently found in quiet adaptability, in humble persistence, in the courageous drawing of life and sustenance from an unseen, often mysterious, yet always sufficient divine source. His own profound, abiding peace, he felt with a fresh wave of gratitude, was very much like that tiny, courageous alpine flower, meticulously, lovingly nurtured in the hidden, secret, often unseen places of his soul by a divine power far beyond his own imagining, yet bringing a quiet, enduring beauty, a surprising, resilient strength, and a gentle, fragrant blessing to his simple, solitary, yet deeply meaningful daily life in this sacred, hidden valley. As the great golden disk of the sun began its slow, majestic, inexorable descent towards the sharply etched, distant western peaks, casting increasingly long, cool, blue-green shadows across the wide, verdant expanse of the high alpine meadow, Caleb knew, with the ingrained certainty of a lifetime spent in these mountains, that it would soon be time to gather his beloved flock and begin the familiar, peaceful journey back down into the deepening shadows of the valley floor, towards the welcome safety, the familiar comfort, and the nightly repose of the boma and his humble cabin. But there was, within him, absolutely no sense of unwelcome urgency, no feeling of anxious pressure to begin the laborious descent before darkness fully fell. The profound, all-encompassing peace that had so faithfully anchored his entire day remained utterly steadfast, calm, and serene. He felt a quiet, joyful readiness for the familiar evening routine, a gentle, almost eager anticipation of the deep, restorative rest that he knew, with absolute certainty, would follow in its appointed time. He had been generously, abundantly given all the strength he needed for this day, for all its varied tasks and subtle challenges, and he trusted, with an unwavering, childlike faith, that that same divine strength would be just as generously, just as abundantly renewed for the next day and all the days to follow. He looked out with an expression of profound, almost ineffable tenderness over his peacefully grazing flock, over the breathtaking, beloved expanse of his valley home, over the whole magnificent, God-breathed tapestry of his world, and his grateful heart was filled to overflowing with a deep, quiet, almost uncontainable gratitude. The Lord was indeed his faithful, loving shepherd, and because of that glorious, liberating truth, he truly, deeply, joyfully did not want for anything, for in the calm, secure, sun-drenched haven of a spirit, completely, utterly rested in its own God, he had found, and continuously found, all that he truly, fundamentally, ever needed or desired. The profound, life-altering lessons so gently, so lovingly imparted during the sacred silent watches of the preceding night had become the deeply, ingrained, effortlessly practiced, and joyfully lived wisdom of his new, grace-filled day. His mind, calm and reflective as a still mountain pool at midnight, drifted to the supremely comforting, timelessly beautiful imagery of the 23rd Psalm, that quintessential shepherd's song, and particularly to the verse that had sustained countless souls through millennia of trial and tribulation. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Eldoria, his cherished home, his sacred sanctuary, was certainly no valley of the shadow of death in any grim, literal, or terrifying sense. It was, for him, a place of abundant life, of breathtaking beauty, of profound spiritual replenishment, and profound, enduring peace. Yet, Elias understood. With a wisdom forged in the crucible of a long life lived in close, daily intimacy with the often harsh and unforgiving realities of nature, that life itself, for every human soul, often, inevitably, involved walking through various kinds of metaphorical valleys of shadow, deep, dark, disorienting valleys of personal grief, of gnawing uncertainty, of paralyzing fear, of soul-crushing weariness, of spiritual desolation. And what enabled one to successfully, faithfully traverse those inevitably shadowed, often painful places without succumbing to utter despair or losing one's spiritual bearings was the unwavering, deeply held conviction of God's immediate, loving, empowering presence, the comforting, tangible assurance of His divine guidance and His omnipotent protection, so beautifully, so perfectly symbolized by the shepherd's familiar, indispensable tools. The rod for defense, the staff for guidance, his own simple, well-worn shepherd's crook, now being used with unconscious, practiced skill to gently, almost invisibly, guide a momentarily straying, curious ewe back to the safety of the well-trodden path, felt in that moment like a small, humble yet profoundly significant extension of that divine, all-sufficient, eternally comforting authority. He was, he knew, merely an under-shepherd, a fallible human instrument, yet he was privileged to participate in his own small, quiet way, in the infinitely greater, infinitely more compassionate, redemptive work of the great, good shepherd of all souls. This thought filled him with a humility so profound it was almost painful, and a gratitude so immense it was almost uncontainable. The long, winding journey downwards from the high alpine meadow was accomplished with the quiet, seamless efficiency that comes only from decades of ingrained practice and intimate familiarity with the terrain. The two faithful dogs, Old Shep and young Bess, worked together with an almost preternatural, telepathic understanding, their movements fluid, purposeful, and remarkably economical, their occasional low, instructive barks almost conversational. In tone, gently, patiently directing the steady, unhurried flow of the large woolly flock. Elias himself rarely needed to verbally intervene or physically command. His calm, reassuring presence, his familiar comforting scent carried on the cool evening breeze, his well-known loved silhouette against the darkening sky were often more than enough to keep the trusting sheep moving steadily, peacefully, confidently towards the longed-for safety, the familiar comfort of their nightly home. He observed them all with a tender, incredibly watchful, almost paternal eye, his shepherd's heart filled to overflowing with a quiet, deep-seated affection that transcended by far the merely practical, utilitarian relationship of a man and his valuable livestock. These were his living charges, his woolly, extended family in this beautiful, yet profoundly solitary place, and their continuing health, their daily well-being, their nightly safety, was for him a deeply felt, almost sacred personal trust. The profound, unshakable peace that resided so deeply within his own soul allowed him to exercise this weighty trust not with any sense of anxious, fretful overmanagement or burdensome, wearying hypervigilance, but with a calm, serene, confident watchfulness, a peaceful assurance born of faith. As they finally reached the familiar, gently sloping pastures that immediately surrounded his humble stone cabin and the secure, welcoming boma, the last, faintest vestiges of the evening twilight were definitively yielding to the deeper, more encompassing darkness of full, unadulterated night. The first, brightest stars were beginning to blaze with a cold, clear, almost fierce brilliance in the vast, dark, overarching vault of the high mountain sky. The air was remarkably still, almost breathless, and the only discernible sounds were the soft, almost silent padding of countless woolly hooves on the dew-dampened grassy earth, the gentle, contented, collective breathing of the now slowing sheep, and the distant, constant, soothing murmur of the ever-faithful Eldoria stream. There was a profound, almost tangible sense of pervasive peace, of inherent rightness, of a days-long, arduous, yet deeply satisfying cycle, brought to a good, fitting, and entirely satisfactory completion. With gentle, practiced movements, Elias guided the entire flock into the safe, familiar, secure enclosure of the boma. Its sturdy, time-tested stone walls and its dense, protective thorn branch reinforcement, a welcome, reassuring sight in the gathering, deepening gloom. The sheep settled almost immediately, their soft, contented, almost conversational bleating forming a gentle, pastoral chorus, their warm, woolly bodies a comforting, reassuring mass in the cool, enveloping darkness. With the entire flock safely and peacefully enclosed for the night, Elias carefully, securely fastened the simple yet effective wooden hurdle that served as the boma's gate. He stood motionless for a long, contemplative moment, simply listening with a deep, quiet satisfaction to the myriad soft, comforting sounds of his beloved sheep, settling down for their nightly rest. The gentle rustling of wool against wool, the occasional soft stamp of a hoof, the deep, contented sighs of animals feeling safe, secure, and well-fed. A profound, almost overwhelming sense of quiet, humble accomplishment washed over him. The day's demanding work was well and truly done. He had faithfully led them to good, nourishing pasture. He had vigilantly kept them safe from all perceived and unseen harm. He had successfully, lovingly brought them all home again. And through all the varied experiences and subtle challenges of this long day, he himself, he knew with an unshakable certainty, had been just as faithfully led, just as vigilantly kept, just as lovingly sustained by a peace that was most emphatically not of his own making, a strength that was not of his own summoning. He felt a profound, almost unutterable gratitude for the simple, yet deeply meaningful, divinely ordained rhythm of his shepherd's life, for the clear, unwavering sense of purpose it consistently provided him, for the constant, myriad, often unexpected opportunities it so generously afforded him for experiencing God's immediate, loving presence in the very heart of his magnificent, untamed creation. He turned at last, with a contented sigh, towards his own small, humble stone cabin, where the faint, almost invisible yet deeply welcoming glow of the dying embers in the well-swept hearth could just be discerned through the uncurtained window, a tiny beacon of warmth and domestic peace in the vast, cool darkness of the valley. He looked up, as was his unfailing nightly habit, at the vast, star-strewn, almost impossibly beautiful high mountain sky, and his shepherd's heart, a heart already so full, was yet filled further with a quiet, reverent, almost trembling awe. The same omnipotent, incomprehensible God who had so masterfully created this unimaginable, breathtaking universe, who effortlessly held these countless blazing stars in their eternally appointed courses, was, he knew with a faith that needed no further proof, the very same God who had so patiently, so lovingly, so intimately walked with him, a simple, humble, solitary shepherd, through all the mundane routines and quiet wonders of his long, grace-filled day, whose profound life-giving peace had been his constant, unwavering companion, whose inexhaustible divine strength had been his unfailing, ever-present support. He felt infinitesimally small in the face of such cosmic grandeur, yet at the very same precious moment, he felt infinitely, immeasurably cherished. He felt profoundly solitary in his physical existence, yet at the same time, deeply, inextricably connected to all of life, to all of creation, to the very heart of God. He felt wonderfully, satisfyingly weary from his wholesome labors, yet simultaneously, deeply, gloriously, wonderfully at peace. The gentle, unspoken, yet irresistible invitation to profound, restorative rest was once more softly, tenderly beckoning, and Elias, his simple shepherd's heart overflowing with boundless, inexpressible gratitude, was entirely, joyfully ready to receive its blessed, healing gift. The hidden ancient valley of Eldoria was slowly, peacefully settling into its deep, nocturnal slumber, and its faithful, humble shepherd, a man of quiet, unshakable faith, and profound, God-given peace, was reverently, gratefully preparing to do exactly the same. His calm, contemplative gaze fell once more upon his trusted shepherd's crook, resting faithfully in the corner where he always, without fail, placed it at the end of his working day. Its beautifully smoothed, richly darkened, age-worn wood seemed to hold within its very grain the living, palpable memory of countless thousands of arduous journeys through all kinds of weather, countless thousands of gentle, guiding nudges bestowed upon his woolly charges, countless thousands of long, solitary moments of quiet, unwavering vigilance under sun, moon, and stars. It was, for him, far more than just a tool of his ancient trade. It was a profound, multifaceted symbol of his weighty responsibility, his life-defining work, his very shepherd's identity. Yet, as he now prepared himself for the blessed oblivion of sleep, he knew he would, as he did every night, lay that beloved crook entirely aside, both in the literal, physical sense and in the deeper, more significant metaphorical sense. He would, with complete, unreserved, and joyful confidence, entrust his precious flock, his beautiful hidden valley, his own very life and breath, to the infinitely capable, exquisitely tender, and ceaselessly vigilant care of the great, good, eternal shepherd, whose divine crook was infinitely stronger, infinitely more encompassing than his own, whose all-seeing watchfulness never, ever ceased, day or night. This sacred nightly act of profound conscious surrender, this deliberate willing entrusting of all that he was, and all that he had, and all that he hoped for into the loving, omnipotent hands of his God, was, he had long since discovered, the absolute indispensable key to his remarkable, consistent ability to rest so deeply, so peacefully, so restoratively. It was not, he understood, any kind of cowardly abdication of his God-given responsibilities, but rather a wise, courageous, and profoundly humble acknowledgement of his own inherent human limitations and of God's truly unlimited, all-sufficient, divine capacity and grace. He remembered, with a fresh wave of comforting reassurance, the precious, timeless words of Jesus spoken to his anxious, bewildered disciples on the very eve of his own unimaginable suffering and sacrificial death. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. These sacred words, spoken in a moment of profound impending sorrow and cosmic upheaval for those who first heard them, had always resonated with a particular, powerful poignancy deep within Elias's own reflective, often solitary soul. His own life, though outwardly and anecdotally largely peaceful, and blessedly uneventful compared to the tumult of the wider world, was certainly not without its own subtle internal shadows, its own unspoken, gnawing questions, its own inevitable encounters with loss, disappointment, and the universal human experience of existential angst. But the crucial choice, he knew with every fiber of his being, was always, in every circumstance, whether to allow his heart to be troubled and overwhelmed by these things, or to consciously, deliberately, courageously choose to place his entire, unwavering belief, his complete, childlike trust in the unchanging bedrock reality of God's sovereign goodness, his omnipotent power, and his perfect, all-encompassing eternal love. Tonight, his shepherd's heart was profoundly, blessedly, gloriously untroubled, not because all potential for future trouble or sorrow had miraculously, permanently vanished from the world or from his own life's path, but because his deep, abiding trust was so firmly, so unshakably anchored in the eternal verities. His simple, profound belief, a quiet, steady, inextinguishable flame, burning brightly and warmly within the most sacred chamber of his being. The deep, profoundly restorative, divinely gifted sleep of the preceding night had served with remarkable, miraculous efficacy to powerfully reinforce that spiritual anchor, to thoroughly clear away all the accumulated clinging debris of worldly fear and human doubt, and to gently, lovingly fan that precious, fragile flame of living faith into a much brighter, more resilient, more confidently radiant glow. The natural, wholesome weariness of his well-used physical body was now a gentle, almost irresistible, deeply welcome invitation to surrender. His eyelids felt increasingly, wonderfully heavy, like soft velvet curtains slowly, gracefully drawing closed upon the stage of his waking thoughts. His limbs, having faithfully carried him through all the day's varied exertions, felt wonderfully relaxed, pleasantly heavy, eagerly anticipating the complete release and profound rejuvenation of deep, untroubled rest. The keen alertness that had characterized his shepherd's watch was now gracefully, peacefully softening, giving way to a delicious, almost intoxicating drowsiness that promised imminent, blissful oblivion. He rose slowly, almost reluctantly, from his comfortable ancient armchair, the old familiar floorboards groaning a soft, almost affectionate complaint under his familiar weight, a sound as comforting and as much a part of his home as the crackling of the fire or the sighing of the wind. He carefully, reverently marked his place in the ancestral Bible. Though he hadn't actually read much with his physical eyes this evening, his communion having been of a deeper, more contemplative kind, and then he set the sacred volume with gentle care on the sturdy table beside his chair. He then proceeded to perform his simple, unchanging nightly rituals, ensuring the beeswax candle was burning safely and would eventually extinguish itself without hazard, checking for the third and final time that the sturdy wooden door to the outside world was securely latched against the chill night winds, and any potential, though highly unlikely, intrusion, and taking one last, lingering look at the old, reliable barometer on the wall, whose steady, unwavering needle continued to promise another night of relative meteorological calm, a small, tangible reassurance in his ordered, predictable world. Each small, deliberate, almost ritualistic action was a further, gentle step away from the demands and responsibilities of the day, a quiet, conscious, peaceful bringing of harmonious order to his small, rustic domain, perfectly mirroring the deep, profound, divinely established inner order that Grace had so wonderfully, so powerfully re-established within his grateful soul during the preceding night. These were not anxious, obsessive tasks performed out of fear or compulsion, but rather peaceful, mindful acts of responsible stewardship, of loving, grateful care for the simple, precious gifts of his solitary, yet richly blessed, existence, as he finally prepared himself for bed, standing for a quiet, reflective moment by the small, deeply recessed window of his sleeping alcove. He looked out with awe and wonder at the vast, silent, breathtaking expanse of the star-dusted night sky, arching majestically over his hidden, sleeping valley of Eldoria. The myriad stars, diamonds scattered lavishly by the Creator's hand upon an infinite bolt of deepest velvet, blazed with a cold, clear, almost fiercely intense brilliance in the pure, rarefied, high-altitude air. Each distant, glittering star, he knew, was a colossal, fiery sun, a testament to God's unimaginable, explosive power, His incomprehensible, intricate artistry, His eternal, unwavering faithfulness. Yet also he felt with a certainty that warmed his very soul. Each tiny, twinkling point of light seemed like a distant, friendly, almost personal eye, winking down at him with gentle reassurance, a silent, cosmic promise of constant, loving companionship. Throughout all the long, dark, silent watches of the vulnerable night, lying down at last upon his simple, fragrant, sheepskin-covered bed, the cool, clean, homespun linen sheets felt wonderfully welcoming against his tired skin, and the familiar, comforting weight of the heavy, hand-woven woolen blanket was like a gentle, secure, loving embrace. He closed his eyes, and the myriad subtle, familiar sounds of the external world, the gentle crackle of the last dying embers in the distant hearth, the soft, intermittent sigh of the night wind as it explored the sturdy eaves of his ancient stone cottage, the distant, constant, soothing murmur of the Eldoria stream singing its timeless, eternal lullaby as it journeyed onward to the unknown sea, began to recede, to soften, to merge into a single, harmonious, deeply comforting, almost hypnotic cadence, drawing him gently, irresistibly, peacefully downwards into the welcoming, restorative, profoundly healing depths of rejuvenating slumber. There was absolutely no inner struggle, no mental resistance, no final flurry of restless, anxious thoughts to battle or subdue. His mind was wonderfully, blessedly still. His heart was profoundly, gloriously at peace. His body was eagerly, gratefully, ready for its nightly renewal. He was, in these last precious moments of fading consciousness, exactly like a small, trusting, utterly exhausted child, weary beyond measure from a long, joyful day of exuberant, innocent play, now surrendering himself with complete, unconditional, blissful trust into the strong, safe, infinitely loving arms of his Heavenly Father. His very last conscious thought, before the gentle velvet curtain of sleep finally, completely descended, was not a formulated worry or a specific plan for the morrow, but rather a profound, all-encompassing, almost overwhelming feeling and an ineffable, visceral sensation of being utterly, completely, unconditionally held, of being perfectly, unassailably safe, of being infinitely, eternally, and overwhelmingly loved. He yielded his entire being to the approaching, welcoming darkness, not as a fearsome enemy to be resisted or a desolate void to be endured, but as a sacred, fertile sanctuary, a holy, transformative space where the deepest, most profound healing, the most intimate, life-altering communion with the divine could and would surely miraculously occur. The dedicated, faithful keeper of the ancient seeds of Eldoria, having so diligently, so lovingly tended his precious, dormant charges throughout the long day, and so steadfastly, so vigilantly kept his appointed watch, was now himself being gently, tenderly, lovingly gathered into the great, silent, infinitely peaceful fold of divine, restorative rest, under the ceaseless, unwavering, infinitely loving gaze of the great, eternal keeper of all life, all hope, all seeds of potentiality, the shepherd who never ever slumbers nor sleeps. The peace within him was profound, immeasurable, almost palpable. The surrender of his will was absolute, joyful, complete, and the divine promise of holistic, life-giving restoration was sure, certain, and gloriously at hand. The gentle, irresistible, and all-encompassing tide of profound, God-given sleep, having faithfully answered the unspoken invitation of a spirit wholly at peace and a body honorably weary, now carried Elias Thorne, the keeper of Eldoria's ancient seeds, swiftly, smoothly, and entirely away from the last, lingering vestiges of the familiar, sunlit shores of conscious thought and purposeful action, out into the deep, silent, luminous, and utterly restorative ocean of sacred, nocturnal slumber. The final faint echoes of his waking awareness, the cherished image of his humble stone cabin nestled securely in its hidden valley sanctuary, the memory of the rhythmic, reassuring sweep of the great lighthouse beam. If this story had been about Silas, which it is not, but rather the deep-felt memory of the last star he had gazed upon before closing his eyes, the ancient, soothing murmur of the ever-present Eldoria stream, singing its timeless, eternal lullaby as it journeyed onward to unknown seas. All these impressions dissolved completely, like insignificant dewdrops evaporating in the first warm kiss of a majestic, rising sun. What remained for Elias was only the boundless, tranquil, almost palpable expanse of his own inner being, now utterly open, entirely receptive to the silent, transformative, healing touch of the divine. His breathing, now as slow, as deep, and as perfectly regular as the ancient, almost imperceptible rhythms of the turning earth itself, as it kept its celestial appointments, became the soft, gentle, anapestic meter of a sacred, unwritten poem, of profound rest, complete renewal, and unwavering, childlike trust being inscribed by the finger of God upon the very tablets of his grateful soul. The extraordinary, almost tangible peace that had been his steadfast, loyal, life-giving companion throughout all the varied moments of the preceding day had now become the very essence, the very atmosphere, the very substance of his profound, healing sleep, an all-encompassing, benevolent ocean of serenity in which his redeemed spirit floated, entirely weightless, blissfully joyful, and perfectly, eternally secure, cradled with infinite tenderness in the gentle, loving, omnipotent currents of God's everlasting, all-sufficient presence. In this profound, hallowed sanctuary of deep, restorative unconsciousness, the meticulous, divinely orchestrated work of holistic restoration, which had subtly, almost invisibly, yet undeniably, continued throughout all his waking hours due to the remarkable, prevailing calm of his inner state, now proceeded with an unimpeded, almost miraculous, profound efficacy and grace. It was as if his immortal soul, having been so carefully, so lovingly prepared and swept clean of all worldly dross and anxious clutter throughout the course of the preceding grace-filled day, was now a perfectly sanctified, entirely open, and eagerly receptive chalice, ready to be filled to overflowing beyond all measure, with the pure, clear, life-giving, eternally springing waters of divine grace, divine love, and divine peace. The subtle, almost imperceptible stresses and nearly invisible spiritual abrasions that even the most peaceful and well-ordered day might inevitably impart upon the sensitive human spirit. The almost unnoticeable weariness that gradually, quietly, accumulates in the very sinews of both body and soul through the ongoing process of living and engaging with the world, were now being gently, tenderly, lovingly washed away, completely dissolved, and miraculously replaced by a fresh, vibrant, potent infusion of inexhaustible spiritual vitality, of quiet, resilient, unshakable strength, of profound, transcendent, almost ecstatic joy. This was not, Elias experienced even in his deepest slumber, merely a temporary, passive cessation of worldly activity or mental striving. It was a dynamic, active, divinely energized process of profound, holistic recreation, meticulously, lovingly, orchestrated by the omniscient, omnipotent Master of all life, who was, at this very moment, tenderly, compassionately, and joyfully tending to the deepest, most hidden needs of his beloved, trusting, surrendered child. If any fleeting, ephemeral dreams traversed the vast, silent, luminous landscape of his profound slumber, they were most certainly not the troubled, disjointed, anxiety-ridden, fragmented phantoms that so often haunt the unquiet sleep of a disturbed or overburdened mind. Instead, they were far more akin to serene, radiant, almost beatific tapestries, woven with exquisite skill from threads of purest, uncreated celestial light, from strands of ineffable, unimaginable joy, and from the very substance of God's unconditional, everlasting love. He might perhaps experience a profound, almost indescribable sensation of walking with light, buoyant steps through celestial, paradisiacal gardens of such breathtaking, otherworldly beauty that every perfectly formed flower, every miraculously vibrant leaf, every dew-kissed blade of grass seemed to resonate with a silent, yet overpoweringly glorious hymn of ecstatic, unending praise to its Creator. Or perhaps he felt himself completely, blissfully enveloped, almost dissolved, within a celestial chorus of harmonies so pure, so clear, so exquisitely, heartbreakingly beautiful. They seemed to be the very audible sound, the very vibrational essence of God's infinite, sacrificial, redeeming love, healing every old wound, soothing every hidden sorrow, and uplifting his entire spirit to heights of joy and peace that were utterly beyond all earthly comprehension or description. These were not, he would know upon some level of his being, mere insubstantial figments of an idle, dreaming brain, easily dismissed with the morning light. They were sacred, transformative encounters, profound spiritual nourishments, mystical infusions of divine reality that would leave their indelible, life-altering imprint of profound peace, unshakable hope, and boundless joy upon the deepest strata of his soul, ready to be carried forth with quiet confidence and loving service into the clear, bright, waiting light of a new, unblemished dawn, the great, silent, ancient mountains of Eldoria, their formidable, steadfast peaks now perhaps touched with the ethereal silvered glow of a setting moon, or the first, faintest promise of distant starlight yielding to an even more distant pre-dawn luminescence, stood as majestic, unwavering, timeless symbols of God's eternal, unchangeable, covenant-keeping nature. And Elias, sleeping so soundly, so peacefully, so securely in their ancient, protective, almost maternal embrace, was a living, breathing, human testament to the profound, life-transforming peace that comes, inevitably and abundantly, from consciously, willingly choosing to rest with complete, childlike trust in that unchangeable divine faithfulness. He was, in these sacred hidden hours, like a precious beloved infant held securely, tenderly, and joyfully in the strong, capable, infinitely loving arms of an all-powerful, all-wise, all-good Heavenly Father, his every unspoken need perfectly anticipated, his every conceivable vulnerability completely, omnipotently protected. The encompassing darkness of the deepest night held absolutely no lingering terror, no subtle threat, no disquieting apprehension for him, for he was, and knew himself to be, dwelling securely, unshakably, in a divine, uncreated light that no earthly or spiritual darkness could ever, under any circumstances, extinguish or overcome. The pure, radiant, indwelling light of God's constant, loving, life-giving presence, a holy, unwavering, eternal beacon, shining brightly and warmly within the most sacred hidden sanctuary of his grateful, redeemed soul. His precious, trusting flock, resting with a deep, instinctual, animal peacefulness in the nearby, well-secured boma, was a tangible, daily, living reminder to him of the profound, unthinking trust that simple, dependent creatures naturally rightly place in the wisdom, care, and protection of their devoted, responsible shepherd. And Elias, in his own profound, restorative, human sleep, was now embodying an even deeper, more conscious, more spiritual kind of trust, a complete, utter, and joyful reliance on the good, great chief shepherd, whose boundless love knew no limits or conditions, whose compassionate care never ever faltered or failed, whose omniscient watchfulness never ever slumbered or slept. He had, throughout the preceding day, faithfully, diligently, and lovingly fulfilled all his earthly pastoral duties to the very best of his human ability. And now, in this complete, willing surrender to the sacred mystery of sleep, he was just as faithfully, just as obediently, fulfilling his equally important God-given need for divine renewal, for spiritual replenishment, for holistic restoration, humbly and gratefully recognizing that all his strength, all his wisdom, all his patience, his very life and breath, were precious, unmerited gifts, continually, miraculously received from a gracious, benevolent, and infinitely abundant giver. This profound, life-shaping understanding, woven by years of experience and faith into the very warp and woof of his being, was the inexhaustible, eternally reliable source of his remarkable, resilient, almost supernatural peace. As the long, silent, sacred hours of the deep night progressed, marching with slow, majestic, inevitable certainty towards the eventual, unseen, yet absolutely certain promise of a new day, the profound, divinely orchestrated work of holistic restoration within Elias Thorne continued with undiminished, unwavering, miraculous efficacy, layer upon silent, grace-filled layer. His mind, that busy, often restless loom of thought and perception, was being thoroughly cleansed and wonderfully cleared of all worldly clutter, all anxious speculation, all regretful rumination. His heart, that sensitive, vulnerable vessel of human emotion, was being gently, tenderly filled to overflowing with all divine comfort, all heavenly joy, all unshakable hope. His spirit, that eternal, God-breathed spark of divine consciousness within him, was being exquisitely, perfectly, retuned by the master musician to the flawless celestial pitch of divine harmony, of perfect unassailable peace. He was being meticulously, lovingly, and joyfully prepared in this holy, hidden stillness by the hand of God himself, not just for another demanding day of faithful, often arduous shepherding in the beautiful, yet challenging, Valley of Eldoria, but for a continued, ever-deepening journey of unwavering faith, for a more intimate, more joyful, more fruitful walk with his beloved Creator and Redeemer, for a more radiant, more authentic, more compelling reflection of the boundless, sacrificial love and the perfect, transformative peace that he himself had so abundantly, so miraculously received. The humble, earthly keeper of the seeds was being divinely kept by the eternal seed of all life. The watchful shepherd was being tenderly shepherded by the good shepherd, who laid down his life for the sheep. The beloved child of God was being profoundly, perfectly, eternally loved and renewed. Dear listener, as Elias Thorne, the keeper of the seeds, rests so deeply, so securely, so peacefully in his hidden valley sanctuary of Eldoria, cradled with infinite tenderness in the unwavering, omnipotent, everlasting love of the great shepherd of all souls, may you too, in this very moment, find such a sacred, restorative sanctuary for your own precious, weary heart. Remember now the quiet, unshakable strength of the ancient, silent mountains, the gentle, persistent murmur of the life-giving stream, the steadfast, distant shining of the eternal stars, all potent, beautiful symbols of God's enduring, faithful presence in your own life, His constant, tender, life-sustaining grace that surrounds you even now. Release now, completely and willingly, all the lingering burdens of this now completed day, all the unspoken worries and anxieties that may still cling tenaciously to your mind, all the accumulated weariness that may have settled deeply into your body and your soul. Entrust them all, without reservation, into His infinitely strong, infinitely capable, infinitely loving hands. Trust implicitly in His precious, unfailing promise to give His beloved children deep, restorative, soul-healing sleep. Allow the gentle, peaceful spirit of this simple story, the profound, inspiring tranquility of this humble shepherd's unwavering faith, to guide you softly, tenderly, inexorably into your own personal, hidden valley of serene, untroubled, rejuvenating slumber. Breathe in deeply and consciously His palpable, all-sufficient peace. Exhale fully and completely all your lingering cares and fears. Surrender your entire being to the loving, powerful, restorative embrace that your Heavenly Father so freely, so eagerly, so joyfully offers to you this very night. May His perfect, indescribable peace be your softest, most comforting pillow. May His constant, loving presence be your unassailable, omnipotent protection through all the dark hours. And may you awaken in the morning light incredibly refreshed, wonderfully renewed, joyfully restored, and eagerly ready to walk with renewed strength, purpose, and delight in the radiant, glorious, unending light of His abundant, unconditional, and everlasting love. Amen.